Any stevedore knows you can't store flour next to fish oil. Within a week, it'll stink to high heaven and get thrown out. Dan had known this for 7 years, and now here he is, standing in a stranger's body in a strange world, looking down at strange barrels, not thinking about how to get home. He's thinking that someone here doesn't know how to store flour. That thought will make him the most dangerous man on the continent. But first, let's rewind. The first thing he feels is the cold, that distinct chill of a warehouse's concrete floor. Dan opens his eyes. Above him are crooked wooden beams. One is cracked and hanging by a thread. He tries to sit up. The body won't obey. The hands are not his, thin, calloused, with dirt under the nails. He brings them up to his face and stares intently at his fingers. Not his. His were wider and stronger, with a scar on his right index finger from a stationary knife. These belong to someone else. Dan sits up. His head is spinning. It's pounding in his temples. And then someone else's memory gushes out like water from a burst pipe. A name. Dan. Also Dan. An orphan. A laborer. 20 years old. He owes the landlord for a corner in the hayloft. They beat him yesterday. For a broken jug. Dan from Seattle sits on the dirt floor in the body of Dan from the Middle Ages and holds on so he doesn't go mad. He closes his eyes. Opens them. Barrels. Mice. The stench of rancid grease. Let's say he died. The rack collapsed. 2 tons of canned goods. He remembers the crack of metal, the darkness, and now this. Dan stands up. His knees are shaking. His body is weak and hungry, but it stands. He looks around. A warehouse, abandoned. A shed with pretensions, and the first thing that rises in him isn't fear. It's irritation. Professional, pure. The flour stands next to the barrels of fish oil. The flour soaks up the smells. In a week, it'll be thrown out. Dan grits his teeth. He rolls up the sleeves of a stranger's shirt and moves the first barrel, then the second. Then he drags the sacks of flour to the far wall where it's drier. He works in silence, methodically. Just as he's gotten used to over 7 years in a warehouse near Seattle. Every item in its place. Heavy items on the bottom. Fragile items separately. He doesn't think where he is or how to get back. He's putting things in order, because that's the only thing he knows how to do well. On the third sack, he finds a dusty stone container with a seal on the lid behind the boxes. He moves it aside, and the air in front of his face changes. Soundlessly, like a laptop screen in a dark room. Pale blue letters appear in the air. Dan freezes. He doesn't know this language, but understands every word. The teleportation warehouse is open. Operator. Daniel Rowe. Volume, 4 cubic meters. Anchor points, 1 out of infinity. Dan reads it again. And then, quietly, in a language no one here knows, he says that finally, some decent software. He reaches out toward the letters. His fingers pass right through them. The text flashes and the interface unfolds. An empty grid. Cells, each showing volume and status. 4 cubic meters of free space. 1 anchor point. This warehouse. Dan looks at the empty interface and, for the first time in 10 minutes in this world, feels at home. A warehouse system, new, waiting for an operator, and the operator stands before it with a loader's calluses and 7 years of inventory experience. He covers the interface with his palm, sits down, clutches his knees, and thinks. Not about magic, not about rebirth. He thinks about flour. About 20 sacks that no one will come for because the owner has gone bankrupt. About the city beyond the walls, about how much bread costs, who sells it, who controls the delivery. These are the right questions. He doesn't yet know that they are precisely what will make him the most dangerous man on the continent. Dan stands up. He brushes off his knees and heads into the city. Halden greets him with noise and filth. Narrow streets, open ditches, crowds jostling and swearing and stinking so badly that Dan's eyes water. He walks slowly, memorizing an old habit. At the new warehouse, for the first 2 hours, he just walks and looks. Where things are, how people move, where the bottlenecks are. The city is a warehouse. Huge, poorly organized. Carts are parked across the streets. Porters drag boxes 3 blocks out of the way instead of taking a direct route. There's a crush near the market because 2 vendors have blocked the only passageway with their stalls. Dan watches, and diagrams form in his head. Routes, interchanges. He shakes his head. It's none of his business. Not yet, anyway. He stops at a bread stall. Round, dark loaves. He doesn't know the price. But he reads the faces in the line. An old woman counts her coins in her palm. A woman with a child stands to the side, looking at the bread but not approaching. A man in an apron takes 1 loaf and walks away. He used to take 2. Dan understands these things. For 7 years, he watched people shop. When the economy goes down, people buy less. They buy cheaper. It's the same here. Only instead of brands, it's just food. And they count the coins not to save money, but to survive. He walks on. He walks around the city all day. He listens, he looks. The slums stretch from the market square to the eastern wall. It's quieter there, and scarier. Children sit on doorsteps with empty eyes. Women wash clothes in murky water. Men stand at intersections and wait. For work, for handouts, for anything. Dan walks past a bakery in an alley. An old man with a gray beard is kneading dough in a wooden trough. There's no sign. The oven smokes crookedly. But the bread smells so good it makes Dan's stomach growl. He stops. The old man looks up. Dan looks like an ordinary slum kid. Skinny, dirty, a nobody. The old man says nothing. He simply breaks off a piece of a fresh loaf and holds it out. Dan takes it. He nods. The bread is warm and dense. Real. The old man goes back to the dough. Dan eats and looks at the bakery. Small, poor, unlicensed. He already knows from others' memories what it means to work without a trading house license. They could come and shut it down at any moment, confiscate the flour, smash the oven, and no one will stand up for him. The old man bakes bread not because he's been allowed to, but because someone has to. Dan finishes the crust, looks at his hands. Someone else's hands with someone else's calluses. And thinks of the 20 sacks of flour in his warehouse. No one's flour. Written off. Forgotten. He turns around and walks back. The trip takes 40 minutes. Dan walks quickly. One thought keeps spinning in his head. 4 cubic meters. 2 pallets. 20 30-kilo bags is 600. 600 won't fit in 4 cubic meters. So 2 trips, or 3. He counts as he walks, automatically. By the time he returns, it's already getting dark. Dan places his hand on the first bag and thinks about the system. The interface lights up immediately. He selects a cell. He pushes the bag. The bag disappears. It doesn't dissolve. It simply ceases to exist. An empty spot on the dirt floor. A line on the interface. 28 kilograms of flour occupies 0.09 cubic meters. Dan exhales. It works. He loads the second one, the third. He has to stop at the 10th. He's out of space. 4 cubic meters, 10 bags, not 20. He sits down on the remaining bag and looks at the interface. 10 bags, 280 kilograms. And at the bottom, small text. Daily cargo turnover, 280 kilograms. Next expansion in 220 kilograms. Dan reads it again. Expansion. Process another 220 kilos and the capacity will increase. He stands up, looks at the remaining 10 bags, looks at the system, and realizes. To load the rest, he has to unload this first, move it somewhere, come back, load it again, process the volume, get the expansion. The usual rotation. He used to do this every day, in his past life, literally. Dan rubs his face with his dirty palms. He needs a second anchor point, a place where he'll take the bags. And he already knows where it will be. A small bakery in a slum alley. An old man with a gray beard. Warm bread. Dan left the warehouse before dawn. The city was asleep. Only stray dogs were rummaging through the gutters, and somewhere in the distance, the night goldsmith's cart creaked. He walked toward the bakery, running through the plan in his head. A simple plan. Show up, stand there for a minute, mark the spot, unload the flour, leave. No talking, no explanations, no unnecessary attention. He reached the spot in 30 minutes. The alley was empty. The bakery was closed. There was a rustling sound coming from behind the wooden wall. Someone was already kneading dough. The old man was working even before dawn. Dan stopped by the back wall of the bakery. There was a tiny courtyard there, a wood shed, empty barrels, and a small nook between the wall and the fence where no one ever looked. Dan stood in that spot, froze, counted the seconds. 1, 2, 10, 20, a minute. The interface flashed. New anchor point confirmed. Point 2. Halden, a slum alley. Done. Now he had 2 addresses, the warehouse and the bakery. Goods could be moved between them instantly. Dan looked at the nook. It was cramped. If he unloaded 10 sacks of flour here, they'd just block the passage. He'd have to do it 1 at a time. Or 2 at a time. He summoned the interface, selected the first sack, specified point 2. The sack appeared at his feet. No sound, no flash. It just appeared, as if it had always been there. Dan picked it up and leaned it against the wall of the awning. Then the second, the third. He worked quickly, with practiced movements. Pick up, rearrange, align. There was no magic between him and the bags. There was only work. The same work as in the warehouse in Seattle, only without a forklift. 10 bags. He arranged them along the wall of the shed, neatly, 2 in a row, flour to flour, labels facing out. Although there were no labels here. Habit. The interface showed that cargo turnover had increased. 560 kilograms. Volume expansion. New volume, 5.2 cubic meters. Dan nodded. 1.5 bags as a bonus. Not much, but it was a start. He looked at the row of bags against the wall and imagined the old man's face when he stepped out into the yard. Then he turned and walked away, quickly, without looking back. On the way to the warehouse, he thought, 10 sacks is about 280 kilos of flour. 1 kilo of flour makes about 1.5 kilos of bread. 280 kilos of flour is 420 kilos of bread. If a loaf weighs about 800 grams, that's 525 loaves. There are about 1,000 people in the slum district, half a loaf per person. 1 day. Maybe 2 if we can serve it. It's not going to save the world, but 2 days without hunger for 1,000 people is already something. Dan returned to the warehouse. He loaded another 5 sacks from the remaining 10. The system accepted them without a problem. The new capacity allowed it. He carried them to the bakery the same way, unloaded, arranged. 15 sacks. Cargo turnover was increasing. The volume had grown to 6.1 cubic meters. Dan loaded the last 5 sacks, carried them, unloaded them. 20 sacks of flour stood in a neat row against the wall of the woodshed behind the old man's bakery. 7, 8 cubic meters, almost twice as much as in the morning, and 2 active points. Dan sat down on an empty crate in a corner and waited. The sun rose. Smoke began to drift out of the bakery. The door to the yard creaked. The old man came out. He saw the sacks. He froze. Dan saw his face change. First confusion, then suspicion, then fear. The old man looked around. No one. Just a skinny guy on a crate in the corner of the yard. The old man walked over to the sacks, felt them, untied one, reached inside, pulled out a handful of flour. White, dry, excellent flour. His hands were shaking. He looked at Dan, asked who had paid for it. Dan shrugged, said the flour had been delivered, that it belonged to no one, that the baker could bake at the old price and the flour would be his. If he raised the price, there would be no more flour. The old man looked at him for a long time. His eyes were red, wet. He said his name was Yorick, that he'd been baking bread in this alley for 20 years, that the trading house had tripled the price of flour, and he thought he'd have to close down, that yesterday his granddaughter had gone to bed hungry. Dan listened, nodded. He didn't interrupt. When Yorick finished, Dan stood up and said it was time for him to go. Yorick grabbed his sleeve, asked his name. Dan said, just Dan. Yorick nodded, said he'd remember. By noon, the smell of fresh bread hung in the slum alley. For the first time in 2 weeks. The line stretched from the bakery to the intersection. A loaf cost what it did before the crisis, 2 pennies, not 6. Dan watched from a distance. He stood on the corner 2 blocks away and watched. The woman with 2 children, whom he had seen yesterday at the market stall, was standing at Yorick's counter. She bought 2 loaves. The children ate right there on the street. They tore the bread with their hands and shoved it into their mouths. The mother stood nearby and stroked their heads. Dan turned away. There was a lump in his throat. A stupid, sentimental lump. He swallowed it and walked back to the warehouse. He needed to think. The 20 sacks would run out in a week. Maybe 2 if Yorick was careful. And then what? He needed a steady supply. He needed new sources. He needed to figure out where the flour even came from in this city. Who ground it? Who grew the grain? What routes? What prices? It was a task for an entire logistics department. And the logistics department was just him, in the body of a 20-year-old orphaned porter with empty pockets and a warehouse management system. Dan returned to his warehouse. He sat down on the floor. He called up the interface. 7.8 cubic meters, 2 dots, 0 stock. He'd given it all away. He closed the interface, lay on his back. The ceiling with its crooked beams, mice in the corner. His stomach was empty. He'd given all the flour to the baker and hadn't eaten a thing since morning. Classic. At the warehouse in Seattle, he'd also forgotten to eat lunch when there was an inspection. Dan closed his eyes. He needed to sleep. Tomorrow he had to look for grain. He fell asleep right on the dirt floor, fully clothed. His last thought was that if storage safety standards existed in this world, this warehouse would have been shut down on the very first day of the inspection. The morning began with a crash. Someone was knocking on the warehouse gate. Dan jumped up. His heart was pounding. Someone else's memories told him that a knock on the door usually meant trouble. A landlord demanding rent, guards collecting taxes, bandits looking for loot. He walked over to the gate. He cracked it open. Yorick was standing outside the gate. The old man looked different. His back was straight. His eyes were clear. He was holding a bundle of linen cloth in his hands. Yorick said he'd brought him breakfast. Bread, fresh, made from that very flour. Dan took the bundle. He unwrapped it. The bread was warm. Yorick said he'd been thinking all night.
That 20 sacks wasn't a coincidence. That the guy who brings flour in the middle of the night and asks only that they not raise the price isn't just some ordinary vagrant. Dan ate the bread and listened. Yorick said things were bad in the city, that the trading houses were crushing all the small, and that 14 workshops had closed in just their neighborhood over the past year. That people were starving, not because there was no food, but because they weren't being allowed to have it. Dan chewed. He knew all this, not from other people's memories, from his own experience. Artificial shortages, delayed shipments to keep prices up. He'd seen it at the warehouse when managers held back goods until the end of the quarter to show better numbers. It was the same here. Only the scale was different, and people were dying because of it. Yorick asked if Dan could get some more. Dan said he'd try. Yorick asked if he could get anything else. Salt, oil, yeast. Dan said he needed to figure it out. Yorick nodded. He was silent for a moment. Then he said he had a granddaughter, Anna, 17 years old. A smart girl, but wild. She lives on the streets. She steals. He can't keep her in line. Dan finished the bread. He thanked him.
Yorick left. Dan stood in the warehouse doorway and thought. He needed to get out of the city, find water sources, mills, farms. But he couldn't just leave. He didn't know the roads. He didn't know the area. He didn't know who was friend and who was foe beyond the walls of Halden. The memories of others helped with the language and the basics, but the orphaned porter had never once in his life ventured beyond the city walls. Dan closed the gate, sat down on the floor, summoned the interface. He looked at the map of waypoints, 2 yellow markers on a dark background. The warehouse, the bakery. 400 meters between them. It was the smallest logistics network in history. But it worked, and it would grow. Dan added a second point at Yorick's bakery and delivered all 20 sacks of flour. The system's capacity grew to 7.8 cubic meters. Yorick began baking bread at the old price and came by in the morning with thanks and a story about the crisis in the city. Dan realized that to continue deliveries, he needed to find sources outside of Halden. For 3 days, Dan didn't leave the city. He walked, he looked, he counted.
There was a saying at the old warehouse in Seattle. Before you transport anything, you need to know what to transport, from where, and to whom. He couldn't afford to make a mistake. One careless delivery, and someone would ask questions he didn't have answers to. That's why he studied Halden, systematically, block by block. He marked 4 more points. The 3rd at the eastern gate, where carts stood waiting to be unloaded. The 4th at the market square in the cul-de-sac behind the fish market. The 5th by the old well in the craftsman's quarter. The 6th on the roof of an abandoned house by the southern wall. The 6th point was important. From there, he could see the entire southern thoroughfare. Caravans, carts, guards at the gates. Dan sat on that roof for hours, watching. He figured out the system in 2 days. Halden stood at the intersection of 3 roads. The western road led to the coast, the southern road to the farming plains, the northeastern road to the mountain provinces. Each route was controlled by a trading house. The western one belonged to the House of Valmont, the southern one to the House of Crashford, the northeastern one to the House of Belrosh. There was a checkpoint on every road. Every wagon paid a toll. Goods couldn't pass without the house's seal. It was a perfect stranglehold. 3 roads, 3 checkpoints, all traffic accounted for. Anyone who tried to smuggle goods around the system paid triple on their next shipment, if they even got a next shipment. Dan didn't learn this from books. He talked to people, with the porters at the gates, with the carters at the inn, with the market vendors. He asked simply, like a working man, "How much does a sack of flour cost? Where it came from? Why it was so expensive?" People answered willingly. A porter isn't an enemy to another porter. He learned that the flour came from the southern farms, that the grain was ground at 3 mills along the Cross River, a 2-day journey to the south, that a sack used to cost 5 copper coins and now cost 15, that the House of Crashford had doubled the duty after the war began in Westmark, officially because of supply disruptions, in reality, because they could. Dan took notes, not on paper, in his head, as he was accustomed to doing. He had kept 14,000 items in his memory over 7 years. A few dozen prices and routes were a drop in the bucket. On the 4th day, he made a decision. He needed to get to the southern mills, a 2-day journey, on foot, through territory controlled by the House of Crashford. Without money, without papers, without weapons. He looked at his hands, skinny, weak, calloused. The perfect disguise. No one would stop a wandering laborer walking along the roadside in search of work. He got ready in an hour. There was nothing to pack. Someone else's memories suggested that vagabonds on the roads carried a sack over their shoulder and a stick to ward off dogs. Dan found both in his warehouse. Before leaving, he stopped by Yorick's. He said he was going away for a few days. Yorick frowned. He asked where. Dan said he was going for flour. Yorick was silent. Then he nodded. He pulled a small bundle from under the counter, bread for the road, and another smaller bundle, dried meat. He said it was from him, so Dan wouldn't go hungry. Dan took them and thanked him. A shadow flashed across the bakery courtyard, quick, nimble. Dan caught it out of the corner of his eye. A skinny girl in a tattered jacket, light, tangled hair, sharp eyes. She was watching him from around the corner. Then she vanished. Yorick sighed. He said it was Anna, his granddaughter, that she'd been wandering around somewhere all night again. Dan nodded and headed for the south gate. The road turned out to be longer than he'd thought. The southern road was a wide dirt track washed out by the rain. Carts left knee-deep ruts in the mud. Dan walked along the shoulder. Trade caravans passed by, heavy ones, with guards. Each bore the seal of one of the houses. No one paid him any attention. A vagrant porter, trash on the shoulder. By evening on the first day, he had passed the Crashford House outpost, a wooden barrier, 2 guards in leather armor. They were checking the wagons, counting the crates, applying seals. They didn't even glance at the drifter with the stick. Dan walked past. His heart was pounding, but his face remained blank. He spent the night by the road, under a tree, wrapped in burlap. He ate Yorick's bread. He looked at the stars. Unfamiliar constellations. Not a single familiar pattern. A different sky. A different world. He lay there and thought of his mom in Seattle, of how she would come to the warehouse and be told that her son had died under a rack, of how she would stand in the morgue and sign the papers. He clenched his teeth. Enough. Can't think about that. Not now. The second day of the journey, the landscape had changed. Hills, fields, the first farms. The wheat stood tall and yellow, almost ready for harvest. Dan looked at it and saw raw material, tons of raw material, that someone had grown. Someone would harvest, someone would grind, and someone would sell for 3 times the price to those who couldn't afford to eat. By noon, he saw the river. wide and slow. The Cross River. Mills stood along its banks, 3 of them, just as he'd been told. The first was large, a stone building, a water wheel, workers, guards. The Crashford House seal on the wall. He gave this one a wide berth. The second was smaller, also bearing the seal. The third stood off to the side, at a bend in the river, old, with a warped wheel. No seal. Dan went to the third one. The mill was running, barely. The wheel turned with difficulty. The millstones creaked. A man in his 40s sat at the entrance, thin, with a tired face. Sacks of grain stood nearby. Not much. A dozen or so. The man looked at Dan without interest. Dan asked if he could buy some flour. The miller smirked. He said he grinds the flour. Farmer Griswood from the upper field sells him the grain, but there's no one to buy his flour. Merchants used to come from Halden, used to come. Not anymore. The big companies have bought out all the merchants. No one gives a small mill without a seal a place in the market. He grinds out of habit, because he doesn't know how to do anything else. The flour piles up in the cellar. It goes bad. Mice eat it. He's thinking of closing down. Dan listened and nodded. Then he asked how much flour was in the cellar. The miller said 40 sacks, maybe 50. He hadn't counted in a long time. Dan asked how much a sack cost. The miller named the price, 3 copper coins. In Halden, the same sack cost 15, a 5-fold markup, just on transportation and duties alone. Dan felt a quiet anger rising inside him. Not hot, cold, practical. The very same anger he'd felt when he'd seen managers in the warehouse writing off usable goods for the sake of paper optimization. He told the miller he'd buy all the flour. The miller looked at him as if he looked over his torn clothes and empty pockets. Dan understood the problem. He had no money, not a single penny. He stood in front of 50 sacks of flour he could take right now, right into the system. And he couldn't. Because he wasn't going to steal. Because the miller wanted to eat too. Dan sat down on a rock by the mill and thought. The miller didn't need money. I mean, he did, but not as much as he needed a market. If he could sell his flour in town without going through the houses, he'd live a decent life. He needed a market. And Dan could give him a market. Not money. Access. He looked at the miller, called him by name. The miller was surprised, said his name was Thomas Grant. Dan said he was offering a deal. He'd take the flour, bring the money in 2 days, 4 pennies a sack, a penny more than the miller had asked for. And from then on, he'd take whatever Thomas ground, every week, at the same price. Thomas looked at him. Then he said that Dan didn't look like a merchant. Dan said he wasn't a merchant. He was a porter. Thomas was silent. Then he stood up, said, "Fine." What did he have to lose? The mice would eat it all anyway. He opened the cellar. Dan went down the stone steps. 47 sacks. He counted them right away, out of habit. Each one about 30 kilos, more than a ton of flour. He marked the spot right in the mill's cellar, 0.7. Then he started working, sack by sack, with his hands on his back. He lifted, he touched. He loaded it into the system. Next. Thomas stood upstairs and watched as the skinny guy hauled sacks out of his basement, and the sacks disappeared, one by one, silently, without a trace. An hour later, the basement was empty. Thomas went downstairs. He looked at the empty floor. He looked at Dan. His face was white. Dan realized he'd made a mistake. He should have done it at night, or not while the miller was there. He told Thomas everything was fine, that the flour was in a safe place, that the money would be there in 2 days. Thomas said he wasn't asking where the flour had gone, that he didn't want to know, that if Dan returned with the money in 2 days, Thomas would forget everything he'd seen. Dan nodded. The interface showed new numbers. Cargo turnover had jumped. The volume had grown to 18 cubic meters, 7 active points, and over a ton of flour in storage. Flour that doesn't spoil,
Doesn't get wet, doesn't rot, just waits. Dan climbed out of the basement, said goodbye to Thomas, and headed back to Halden. Dan studied Halden's transport system and linked 4 new points in the city. He walked to Thomas Grant's mill on the Cross River and loaded 47 sacks of flour into the system in exchange for a promise to pay in 2 days. Thomas saw the flour disappear, but agreed to keep quiet. The system's volume grew to 18 cubic meters and 7 active points. Dan walked back faster. He already knew the way: the roadside, the outpost, the forest, the hill, the southern gates of Halden. He made it by the morning of the 3rd day. His legs ached. His back ached. The body of a 20-year-old porter was resilient, but unaccustomed to long journeys. Dan leaned against the wall by the gate. He caught his breath. Then he headed into the slum district. There was a line at Yorick's bakery, longer than last time. Dan went around through the backyard. Yorick was at the oven. He was running out of flour. Only 3 sacks left out of 20. Yorick saw Dan, and his expression changed. He said he'd thought the boy wouldn't come back. Dan said he still had flour. Plenty. But he needed money, not for himself, to pay the miller. 4 copper coins per sack. If Yorick sells bread for 2 copper coins a loaf, and 1 sack makes about 20 loaves, then he gets 40 copper coins from a sack. After deducting 4 for the flour and 10 for firewood and other expenses, he's left with 26 copper coins net. Yorick looked at him. Then he slowly sat down on the bench. He said that in 20 years, no merchant had ever spoken to him like that. Usually they'd name a price and walk away. But this guy was doing the math with him, as if it mattered to him that the baker made a profit too. Dan didn't answer. To him, it was normal. At the warehouse in Seattle, he always calculated both ways. The supplier has to make money, or he'll stop supplying. The customer has to make money, or he'll stop buying. Logistics isn't about one side. It's about the chain. If one link goes hungry, the whole chain breaks. Yorick pulled a tin box from under the counter. His savings. He counted it. 230 dimes. It was enough to pay for 57 sacks, more than enough. Dan took the money to pay for 47 sacks, 188 pennies, 4 per sack, just as he'd promised the miller. Let Yorick keep the rest. For firewood, for salt, for himself. Yorick took back his 2 copper coins. His hands were shaking. Dan went out into the yard. Night. Quiet. He checked that no one was in the yard. Then he began unloading, sack by sack, from the system to the ground. This time he took his time. He placed them carefully, 4 in a row, 6 rows, 24 sacks, half the supply. He left the remaining 23 in the system, a reserve. Always have a reserve. Yorick stepped out into the courtyard. He saw the bags, 24 of them, exact, neat, like in a store window. He looked at Dan, said that even the trading houses didn't stack them like that. Dan almost smiled. Cargo turnover was growing. The volume had surpassed 20 cubic meters. The system was gaining momentum. Dan thought about the next step. Flour is good, but the city doesn't live on flour alone. It needs salt, oil, meat, medicine, tools. Every commodity has its own supply chain, its own source, its own route, and every route must be walked, in person, to touch, to establish a connection,
to return. He was alone. One pair of hands, one pair of legs, one narrow bottleneck. He needed help. Not for carrying. The system wouldn't allow that. Only he could load and unload. He needed help for everything else. For record keeping. For negotiations. So that someone would keep an eye on Yorick and the bakery while he was gone. So that someone would know where he was and when he'd be back. The next morning, he found Anna. Or rather, she found him. When Dan came out of the warehouse, the girl was sitting on an upside-down bucket across the street, gnawing on an apple, clearly stolen. She stared right at him, without fear, with the curiosity of a predatory little animal. Dan stopped. She said she'd been watching him for 3 days, that she'd seen him head south, that she'd seen sacks appear in her grandfather's yard last night, out of nowhere. Dan said nothing. She said she didn't care how he did it. She wasn't interested in why. Dan looked at her. 17 years old, skinny, grimy, quick eyes, quick hands, a pickpocket, a thief. A kid who'd survived on the streets because she'd learned to steal before she learned to read. He said he needed an assistant, not for stealing, for work. She asked what kind of work. He said she'd have to keep track, write things down, remember who got how much and who owes what. She grimaced, said she didn't know how to write. Dan said he'd teach her. She looked at him for a long time, then asked how much he paid. Dan said 3 meals a day and a corner in the warehouse, not in the hayloft, a normal spot, with a blanket. She was silent. Then she said okay, but if he tried anything, she knew 7 ways to pick a lock and 4 ways to disappear. Dan nodded. He said that was a good set of skills for inventory. She didn't understand the word, but didn't let on. They went back to the warehouse. Dan found a piece of coal and a flat board. He sat on the floor and began to draw. A table, columns, rows, name, quantity, date received, date shipped, recipient. Anna sat next to him and watched. He explained, slowly, in simple words. Here's a bag of flour. Here's how much it weighs. Here's when it arrived. Here's where it went. Here's who received it. If you write everything down, you always know how much you have and how much you need. Anna listened. She didn't interrupt. Then she took a piece of charcoal and copied the table. A little crooked, but correct. The columns were in place. The rows were straight. Dan looked at her. He said it was good for a first try. She turned away, but he noticed that the tips of her ears had turned red. Dan spent the next 3 days in town. He walked through the craftsman's quarter. He talked. He listened. He looked for those in need and those who could supply. A blacksmith named Graham on Coppersmith Street. He was working without orders because the House of Valmont had bought up all the ore supplies. Graham made nails out of old horseshoes. Apothecary Bertrand in the alley behind the market. The shelves were empty. The dried herbs ran out 2 months ago. The Crashford house had raised the import duty on medicinal herbs by 400%. Martha the seamstress in the basement by the well. She sewed with burlap because there was no fabric in the city. All the fabric went through the Belrosh house and cost as much as silver. Dan kept track in his head. The blacksmith needs ore. The apothecary needs herbs. The seamstress needs fabric. The baker needs flour. These were the points of consumption. Now he needed the points of supply. Ore from the mountains, herbs from the forests, fabric from the eastern manufactories. Each point is a journey. Days on the road, on foot, alone. He did the math. Even if he walked every day without stopping, it would take him months to build a minimal network. Months during which people would go hungry and sick and pay 5 times what should cost a penny. He needed to speed things up, and he knew how.
cargo turnover. The more he moves, the more that the system's capacity would grow. And the greater the capacity, the more he could move at a time. The faster the cargo turnover would grow. Positive feedback. Exponential growth. He saw it in the interface. The curve was accelerating. The first 500 kilos yielded a 3 cubic meter increase. The next ton would yield more. He needed to ramp up the volume. That evening, he went to see Yorick. He collected the money for the bread he'd sold, 112 pennies. In the morning, he left the city, headed south, toward Thomas's mill. The journey that had taken 2 days the first time around, he covered in a day and a half. His body was getting used to it. It was getting stronger. Thomas was waiting. Or rather, he wasn't waiting, he was just there, as always. He looked at Dan. Dan took the money out of the sack. 188 copper coins. 4 for each of the 47 sacks, just as promised. Thomas counted it. Twice. He looked at Dan. He said he didn't believe he'd come back. Dan said he always comes back. Thomas nodded. He asked if he needed more flour. Dan said he did. All the flour Thomas could grind, every week. Thomas said he'd ground 12 sacks over the past few days. Dan loaded them up. 12 sacks. 360 kilos. The system's capacity had exceeded 22 cubic meters. Then he asked Thomas if he knew anyone who sold salt. Thomas thought for a moment. He said that in the village of Cross Lake, a half-day's journey upriver, there was an old woman who evaporated salt from a salt spring. Her name was Marin the Widow. She used to sell salt to carters, but ever since Dom raised the duties, the carters had stopped coming. Dan made a mental note of it. He thanked Thomas, and he headed upriver. Dan arranged for regular flour deliveries from Thomas the miller to Yorick the baker and earned his first money. He hired Anna as an assistant and began teaching her bookkeeping. He surveyed the craftsman's quarter and compiled the list of the town's needs. He learned about the village of Cross Lake and the widow who evaporates salt. The village of Cross Lake stood on the shore of a lake into which the Cross River flowed. Small, a dozen or so houses, orchards, vegetable gardens, goats tied up. A silence that made Dan's ears ring after the hustle and bustle of Halden. He arrived around noon, tired, dusty, hungry. 3 old men sat by the well in the center of the village and looked at him as if he were a stranger. He asked where he could find the widow Marin. One of the old men pointed. The house at the far end by the lake, with the red roof. The widow Marin turned out to be a woman in her 60s with rough hands and a sharp gaze. She listened to Dan while standing in the doorway, not inviting him in. He said he wanted to buy salt from her, regularly, at a fair price. She asked who he was. He said he was a porter from Halden. She asked how a porter from Halden planned to get the salt past the checkpoints. He said he had his own way. She looked at him. Then she said she had 30 bags of salt, 2 kilos each, 60 kilos. They cost 2 pennies a bag. Dan agreed. 60 copper coins. He still had 124 left after settling up with Thomas. It was enough. She led him to the shed by the lake. The bags stood in rows on wooden shelves. Neat, dry. Marin the widow knew a thing or two about storage. Dan appreciated that. He waited until she left. He marked the spot. Spot 8. He started loading, bag by bag, 30 of them. This time he was careful. He couldn't be seen. Anyone who sees the goods disappearing is a risk. Thomas had seen. That was already a mistake. No more of that. He loaded the salt. He put the money on the shelf where the bags had been. 60 copper coins. He left the shed. Widow Marin was standing by the house. He told her he'd taken the salt and left the money. She nodded. She didn't go to check. She just nodded. Then she said there was something else in the village. A girl. A herbalist. She lives off the beaten path behind the gardens. If Dan needs medicine, he should go to her. Dan asked what her name was. The widow said Emily. Emily Carter. She lives alone. A strange one. She spends all day digging in the dirt. But she's a good healer. 6 months ago, she cured the blacksmith's son of a fever when the town doctor gave up on him. Dan thanked her and walked through the village toward the gardens. He found Emily's house by the smell. It smelled of herbs, dozens of herbs, dried, fresh, ground. The scent was so thick that Dan sneezed 3 times in a row. The house looked more like a greenhouse. There were garden beds all around. Bundles of herbs were drying on ropes strung between posts. On the porch stood pots with something green and blooming. The girl was crouching by the garden bed, digging in the dirt with her bare hands. Red hair tied in a bun on top of her head. Freckles, dirty fingers, a green smudge on her cheek. She looked up at him. Dan said he was looking for a herbalist. She said he'd found her. He said he needed medicine for the town, for the apothecary whose shelves are empty. She stood up, wiped her hands on her apron, said she had medicine. Decoctions, ointments, dried herbal mixtures, a cellar full of them. Only there was no one to carry them. The last merchant came 4 months ago. He bought 3 sacks of dried berries for next to nothing. He promised to come back. He didn't, and he resold the berries to Dom Crashford for 10 times the price. She spoke calmly, but Dan saw how her fingers, clenching the apron, had turned white. He asked how much finished stock she had. She led him to the cellar. Dan went down and froze. Shelves from floor to ceiling, hundreds of jars, bundles, bags, dried herbs, berries, roots, prepared decoctions in sealed clay jugs, ointments in wooden boxes. Everything was labeled. Everything was organized by category, by shelf life, by use. Dan stood in the middle of that cellar and felt right at home. It was the perfect storage space, small but perfect. Someone who knew what they were doing had organized this space. Every shelf in its place, every jar facing the aisle, heavy items at the bottom, fragile items on the middle shelves, dried goods at the top. He turned to Emily. She was standing on the steps, looking at him. He said it was the best cellar he'd ever seen in his life. She blinked. Then her cheeks flushed beneath her freckles. She said she just loved it when everything was in its place. Dan nodded. He said he did too. He asked how much a basic first aid kit cost. A fever reducer, a painkiller, an antiseptic, a cough medicine, a remedy for an upset stomach. Emily listed the prices. Dan did the math in his head. Everything was cheap, ridiculously cheap. Because there was zero demand. Because merchants didn't make it to the village. Because the house had blocked the road. A classic last-mile problem. There's a product, there's a consumer, a wall stands between them. And the entire cost rests on that wall. He chose the items, with all the money he had left. 64 pennies, 10 bottles of fever reducer, 15 bags of dried berries for scurvy, 8 jars of ointment for burns and wounds, 5 jugs of cough syrup. Emily packed everything into linen sacks. Dan helped. They worked in silence, in unison, as if they weren't doing this for the first time. When the last bag was packed, Dan said he would come regularly, every 2 weeks, maybe more often. He would take whatever she prepared. He would pay on the spot. Emily looked at him. Then she asked why. He didn't understand the question. She explained, why did he need this? He wasn't a pharmacist, not a doctor, not a licensed merchant. Why did he need a bag of burn ointment? Dan paused. Then he said there were people in town who were sick, and there was a pharmacist whose shelves were empty. And it seemed to him that there shouldn't be a wall between the pharmacist and the herbalist, that cost more than the medicines themselves. Emily was silent. Then she sat down on the cellar step. She said quietly that 6 months ago, a child in the neighboring village had fallen ill. A fever. The message had been relayed to her through a shepherd. She had prepared a decoction in 2 hours. She sent it back with the same shepherd. The shepherd walked for 2 days. The child died the day before he arrived. She fell silent. Dan stood beside her and didn't know what to say. He didn't know how to comfort. He didn't know how to say the right words. But he knew how to count, and he did the math. 2 days' journey is that distance. Distance is a logistics problem. A logistics problem is solved by transportation. He had the best transportation in the world. Instant, free, invisible. He told Emily that it wouldn't be like that anymore. That if she prepared the medicine, it would arrive the same day. She looked up at him. She said it was impossible. 2 days' journey. He said it was possible. She didn't believe him, but something in his voice made her not argue. Dan marked a waypoint near Emily's cellar. Waypoint 9. Then he waited for darkness. When Emily went inside, he uploaded his purchases to the system. 38 items. Total weight about 50 kilograms. The system's capacity had grown slightly. Cargo volume was slowly climbing. He spent the night by the river. In the morning, he headed back to Halden. On the way, he stopped by Thomas's place. The miller had ground another 8 sacks. Dan loaded them. The volume grew even more. 26 cubic meters. It wasn't enough for the system. It needed tons, dozens of tons. But every kilogram counted. Every sack brought him closer to the next expansion. He returned to Halden by evening on the second day. Anna was waiting at the warehouse. She was sitting on the floor with a charcoal board, drawing something. A table, a curve, but recognizable. She looked up. She said that while he was gone, people had come to see Yorick. 2 men in fine cloaks, with the Valmont House seal on their buckles. They asked where the flour came from. Yorick said he'd bought it from a traveling merchant. They didn't believe him. They inspected the bakery. They counted the sacks. They left. Dan sat down. This was to be expected. Sooner or later, the houses would notice. 20 sacks of flour at the old price in a neighborhood where bread should cost 3 times as much. That's an anomaly. Anomalies attract attention. He thought. He needed to change the plan. He couldn't deliver everything through a single point. He needed to spread it out. Several bakeries, several shops, small batches, so that no single delivery would look suspicious. He needed more recipients, more sales points, more people he trusts. He looked at Anna, asked if she knew any other bakers in town, or shopkeepers who could be trusted. Anna thought for a moment, said she knew Mrs. Kane, a widow on the next street. She sells soup out the window. Honest, poor. She buys vegetables from middlemen at triple the price. And then there's old man Morgan by the canal. He sells coal, or rather he used to, until the house choked him with tariffs. Now he's sitting idle. But he has a big shed, and he knows how to count. Dan nodded. He took note. In his head. Every name, every address, every need. The network was growing. For now, only in his imagination, but he could already see it. Dozens of points, hundreds of connections. Goods flowing from those who produce to those who consume. Bypassing walls, bypassing duties, bypassing the houses. In the morning, he went to see the apothecary Bertrand. The old man sat behind an empty counter reading a worn-out reference book. Dan placed a bag in front of him. Bertrand opened it. He saw the vials, ointments, dried berries. His hands trembled. He sniffed the contents of one jar, then another. His face changed. Surprise, disbelief, joy he tried to hide. He said these were high-quality preparations, fresh, properly prepared. He asked where they came from. Dan said from an herbalist in the village.
Bertrand said it was a 2-day journey from the village herbalist through the house outpost. How did it get here? Dan said he brought it. Bertrand looked at him. Then he said he wouldn't ask, that he had a boy in his yard with a burn that had been festering for 2 weeks because he had nothing to put on it, that he didn't care where the ointment came from. He grabbed the jar and went into the back room. A minute later, quiet sobbing came from there. Not the boy. The boy was silent. His mother was crying. Dan stood at the counter and looked at the empty shelves. Soon they wouldn't be empty. Soon. He went out onto the street. Sun, mud, the smell of the sewer. A typical day in the slums of Halden. He pulled a loaf of bread from Yorick's morning batch out of the system. He took a bite. The bread was warm. Perfectly warm. The cold cabinet hadn't let it cool down. Dan chewed and thought. 9 supply points, 2 supply routes, flour from Thomas, salt from the widow Marin, medicine from Emily. 3 sources, 3 recipients in town. The baker, the apothecary. Soon there will be a 3rd, and a 4th, and a 5th. Cargo volume is growing. The volume is growing. Every trip makes the next one easier. He walked down the street and, for the first time in all these days in this new world, felt something akin to calm. Not joy, not confidence, just a quiet sense that he was on the right path, that the sacks were where they needed to be, that the invoices added up, that the system is working. Dan made it to the village of Cross Lake, where he bought salt from the widow Marin and met the herbalist Emily Carter. She told him about a child who had died because the medicine took 2 days to arrive, and Dan promised that his deliveries would be instant. Returning to Halden, he handed the medicine over to the apothecary Bertrand. Anna reported that people from House Valmont had come to Yorick with questions about flour. Dan spent 3 days working on a new plan. Anna took him to see the widow Kane, a small woman with hands red from the steam and a voice you could hear 2 blocks away. She was cooking soup in a huge pot by the first-floor window and selling it for a copper coin a bowl. She bought the vegetables from middlemen at triple the price. Carrots, turnips, onions, all small, rotten. The middlemen charged so much for fresh produce that the widow was operating at a loss. Dan sat down on a bench by her window and asked how many vegetables she needed per week. Widow Kane looked at him as if he were asking the obvious. She said 2 sacks of carrots, a sack of onions, a sack of turnips. That's 70 bowls a day. No one would buy more from her anyway. Dan nodded. He made a mental note. Then he went to see old man Morgan. Morgan lived by the canal in a large stone barn, a former coal merchant, a heavy-set man with gray sideburns and heavy hands. The Valmont house had revoked his license 2 years ago. Since then, he'd been sitting in an empty shed, drinking. Dan walked in uninvited. He looked around. The shed was big, dry, with a good roof, an ideal staging area. Morgan watched him from the corner where he sat on a barrel with a mug. Dan said he needed a place, and a man who could count. Morgan said he knew how to count. He'd been counting for 20 years. Deliveries, shipments, debts. What's the point if there's nothing to count? Dan said there would be something soon. Morgan finished his mug, set it down on the barrel, stood up, said, "All right. Show me." Dan marked a point in Morgan's barn, point 10. Now he had 3 distribution points in the city. Yorick's bakery, Bertrand's pharmacy, Morgan's barn. 3 sales channels, different goods, different neighborhoods. None of them made enough to attract the house's attention. Small batches, frequent, inconspicuous. He explained the scheme to Morgan. Goods would pass through the barn. Morgan doesn't ask where they come from. Morgan counts, records, hands them out according to the list, gets a cut from every unit. Morgan listened.
Then he said that 20 years ago, he'd started out the same way. Back then, it was still possible. Back then, the houses hadn't devoured the whole city yet. He asked Dan if he understood what he was doing. Dan said he did. Morgan shook his head, said no, he doesn't understand. But he'll learn. Dan didn't argue. He spent the next week on the road, south to Thomas, loaded 20 sacks of flour, then up the river to the widow Marin, 30 bags of salt. Back to Emily in Cross Lake, 30 jars of ointment, 40 bags of dried herbs, 20 jugs of decoction. Emily had worked all week without looking up. When Dan came for the goods, she looked tired, but her eyes were shining. She said that for the first time in 2 years, her work was going to people and not into mouse holes. Dan loaded everything up. The system's volume exceeded 35 cubic meters. On the way back, he took a detour. He stopped at 3 villages west of Cross Lake. Farmers, carrots, onions, turnips, potatoes, everything was cheap. Everything was in abundance. The farmers were letting half of their harvest rot because they couldn't sell it. The Crashford house had set quotas. Each farmer could sell only a certain amount through approved middlemen. The rest stayed in the ground, or was fed to the pigs. Dan bought it. A dime a sack of carrots, 2 for a sack of potatoes. The farmers didn't believe it. Some suspected a trap. One asked if he was from the house. Dan showed his hands, a loader's calluses. The farmer nodded and sold 3 sacks. Dan was making connections. Every farm, every barn, every cellar. 12, 13, 14 stops. Cargo volume was growing. Volume was growing. By the end of the week, the system showed 42 cubic meters. He returned to Halden, loaded with invisible cargo. 2 tons of goods in a space that fit inside his head. In the evening, he unloaded. Flour to Yorick, salt to Morgan, vegetables to the Kane widow, medicine to Bertrand. Small batches, by the list, to each his own. Anna sat in the warehouse with a charcoal slate and took notes. 20 sacks of flour for Yorick, 30 small sacks of salt for Morgan, 4 sacks of carrots for Mrs. Kane. Her handwriting was improving. The letters were neater, the numbers legible. Dan checked her records. 1 mistake. She had written 30 bags of salt, but Morgan had taken 20. 10 remained in reserve. He showed her. She frowned. She corrected it. She said she wouldn't make a mistake again. He nodded. He said it was okay to make mistakes. The main thing was to double-check. The next morning, Dan woke up to a knocking sound. Not at the door, on the wall. Someone was knocking on the stone wall of the warehouse from the inside. He jumped up. Anna woke up too. She was sleeping in the corner on a mattress Dan had made out of burlap and hay. The knocking came again. From behind the wall. From the alley. Dan walked over to a crack in the wall. He looked. A woman was standing behind the wall. Tall, thin, in a worn travel coat. Light hair pulled back into a tight bun. Her face gaunt, dark circles under her eyes. She was holding onto the wall with one hand. The other was pressed against her stomach. Blood was oozing between her fingers. Dan opened the side door. The woman looked at him. She said she'd been told she could get help here. Who told her? The baker, Yorick. Dan looked at her hand. The wound was deep. A cut, not from a knife, from something long and thin. A sword. He pulled her inside, sat her down on a sack. Anna brought water, a rag. Dan remembered he had some ointment from Emily in his system, antiseptic. He turned away from the woman, summoned the interface, retrieved the jar. Anna watched and said nothing. Smart girl. Dan rinsed the wound with water, applied the ointment, wrapped it in a rag. Not sterile, not by the book, but better than nothing. The woman remained silent while he worked. Didn't flinch. She didn't groan. Patient. Or used to pain.
When he finished, she said her name was Sarah Devris. Dan froze. A surname from someone else's memories. Devris. The Devris Trading House, small, ruined 3 years ago by the Valmont house. He looked at her. She realized he knew. She nodded. She said yes. The daughter of Alan Devris, a former merchant, a former owner, a former living person. Her father had hanged himself in a debtor's prison a year ago. Her mother had died even earlier from a fever that no one could treat because the House of Valmont had confiscated everything from them, including medicine. Sarah worked as a scribe for a bowl of soup at the notary's office. Yesterday, people from Valmont came to the notary. They were looking for documents regarding the Devris estate, old contracts,
Warehouse receipts. The notary handed everything over. But Sarah managed to hide one scroll. The Devris House debtors register. The names of everyone who owed her father money, the amounts, the dates. The Valmont people weren't interested in that. They were interested in Sarah. Because Sarah knew where the remaining documents were hidden. And because Sarah was the last heir to the name they wanted to erase. They cut her while trying to detain her. She escaped through a window. She ran all night through the alleys. In the morning, she made her way to Yorick's bakery. Yorick fed her and told her to go to the guy at the warehouse. Dan listened. Anna listened. When Sarah finished, the room was silent. Then Anna said it was like her own story, only without the swords. Sarah looked at her, then at Dan. She asked who he was. Dan said he was a loader. Sarah said that porters don't pull ointments out of thin air. Dan said nothing. Sarah looked at him. Then she said she didn't care who he was. She needed a place to hide. For a day, for 2, until Valmont's people stopped looking. Dan thought. His warehouse was a lousy hideout. Valmont's people had already been to Yorick's. Sooner or later, they'd check the area. But he had a system. A cold storage unit. He'd never tried putting a living person in there before. He looked at Sarah, then at the system. He thought it was madness, absolute madness. But the wound on her side was deep, and she needed rest, not running through the alleys. He told Sarah he could hide her, safely, but she had to trust him. Sarah looked at him, then she nodded. He touched her shoulder. He called up the interface. He selected an empty cell. And Sarah disappeared. Anna gasped. She covered her mouth with her hand. She looked at Dan with wild eyes. Dan looked at the interface. The cell displayed Sarah Devris, 52 kilograms, status stable, time inside 0. She was alive. Time didn't pass for her inside. She felt nothing. She knew nothing. Like a deep, dreamless sleep. Dan sat down on the floor. His hands were shaking. He had just put a living person into a storage cell. If his foreman from Seattle had seen that, he would have fired him and called the police. Anna sat down next to him. She whispered, "Is she alive?" Dan said yes. "She's sleeping. She's safe." Anna asked when he would get her out. Dan said in the evening, when he was sure the coast was clear. Anna nodded. She was silent. Then she said that Dan was strange, but in a good way. Dan didn't answer. He was sitting on the floor of an abandoned warehouse in a medieval town. He had just hidden the injured daughter of a ruined merchant in a pocket dimension. His life had become strange long before this moment. That evening, he let Sarah out. She appeared in exactly the same condition. Her wound was bandaged. Her eyes were clear. For her, only a moment had passed. She looked around. She saw that it was dark outside the window. She looked at Dan. She asked how much time had passed. He said 10 hours. She was silent for a moment. Then she said it was the longest dream without nightmares she'd had in the last year. Dan gave her bread, water, ointment for the wound. Sarah ate slowly,
neatly. Even in a dirty raincoat with blood on the side, she ate like someone accustomed to using cutlery. A merchant's daughter. Then she looked at Anna's charcoal board, at the chart. Columns, rows, name, quantity, date, recipient. She read silently. Then she looked up at Dan. Said he had no expense column, and no margin column, and no accounts receivable column. Dan blinked, looked at the board. She was right. His spreadsheet was a storekeeper's spreadsheet. Receipts, expenses, balance, but not an accountant's. Sarah stood up. She took a piece of charcoal, and in 10 minutes she redrew the spreadsheet, with double-entry bookkeeping, debit, credit, balance. Every transaction was recorded twice: who it went out to, who it came in from, how much. Dan watched this and felt his chest grow warmer. For 7 years he'd worked with accounting systems that someone else had written for him. He entered data, but he didn't build the structure. And this woman with a scar on her side and a dead father was sitting on the floor of his warehouse, drawing with charcoal an accounting system that was the best thing he'd ever seen in this world. He told her she needed to stay, not as a refugee, as a partner. Sarah looked at him for a long time. Then she said that partnership requires trust, and she hadn't trusted anyone in 3 years. Dan said that was fine. Trust wasn't necessary. Numbers were. If the numbers add up, trust will follow. Sarah almost smiled. Almost. With one corner of her mouth. Then she said, "All right, show me your numbers." Dan expanded his sales network by bringing in Kane's widow and the former merchant, Morgan. He made a major purchasing run through the farms and brought the system up to 42 cubic meters. The wounded Sarah Devris, daughter of a ruined merchant family, came to him, and for the first time, Dan hid a living person in the warehouse system. Sarah stayed on as an accounting partner. With Sarah's arrival, everything changed. Not immediately, gradually, just as a warehouse changes when a competent manager takes over. The first thing she did was demand a full report. Dan sat down and explained everything about the system, about the distribution points, about cargo turnover, about volume. She listened without interrupting. Her face was stony. Only her eyes moved, back and forth, like someone doing mental math. When he finished, she was silent for a minute. Then she said he was an idiot. Dan blinked. She explained. He spends 3 days on each run, on foot, alone. That means a maximum of 2 trips a week, 8 a month, about 100 a year. With an average load of 1 ton per trip, that's 100 tons a year, for all of Halden. 100,000 people. 1 kilogram per person per year. That's nothing. He isn't changing the system. He's putting a Band-Aid on a severed leg. Dan listened. She was right. He knew that, but he hadn't put it that way. Sarah continued. The problem isn't the system's capacity. Capacity is growing. The problem is his legs. He's the only one who can load the cargo, and the only one who can establish new points. So every new point is days of his physical time. He's the bottleneck. A classic bottleneck. Dan almost laughed. She was using a term from logistics, without knowing it was a logistics term, because it was a universal law. He asked what she was suggesting. Sarah pulled out a charcoal board. She drew a diagram. 3 circles: supply, storage, distribution. Supply is Dan. Only him. No alternatives. Storage is the system. No alternatives. Distribution is the people. And this is where you can scale up. He doesn't need to deliver the flour to the bakeries himself. He needs to unload the flour at a single point and have others distribute it from there. He needs a distribution team. Yorick, Morgan, Widow Kane, Bertrand. Each gets their own batch and distributes it through their own network.
And Dan does only what only he can do. He goes around. He sets up distribution points. He loads the goods. He nodded. It was obvious. He should have figured it out sooner. At the warehouse in Seattle, he never handled delivery to the end customer. He assembled pallets, loaded them onto trucks. Then the transport took over. But here he was trying to be the warehouse, the transport, and the store all at once. Stupid. Sarah said the second one was money. He needed working capital. Right now he was buying with his own money, that is, with Yorick's money. That's enough for small stuff, but if he wants to haul ore for the blacksmith or fabric for the seamstress, he needs sums on a whole different scale. She proposed a scheme. Each recipient pays not for the goods, but for a subscription, a fixed amount per week. In return, they get a guaranteed delivery, consistently, without interruptions, without the house's markup. It's cheaper than buying from middlemen and more reliable. And Dan gets a predictable cash flow he can plan with. Dan listened and thought that for 7 years he'd been punching data into a terminal, while all that time there were people like Sarah right next to him who saw not boxes, but systems. He asked how she knew that. Sarah said it was her father, Alan Devris. He'd spent 20 years building a trading house, not the biggest, not the strongest, but the most honest. He paid his suppliers on time, didn't drive prices below cost, didn't cheat customers, and he had been teaching her since she was 10. Accounting, logistics, contracts, risk management. She knew all this better than most heads of trading houses. And that was exactly why the Valmont house destroyed him. Not because he was weak, but because he proved that it was possible to trade honestly and make a profit. That was more dangerous than any competitor. If his model caught on, the houses would have to stop stealing. Sarah fell silent. Her hands lay on her knees, calm. Only her knuckles were white with tension. Dan was silent too. Then he said that her father was right, and that his model was spreading now, through a skinny porter with a magic backpack. Sarah looked at him, and for the first time, she smiled. For real, for a second. Then her face turned to stone again. But that second was enough. They started working together. Sarah took charge of accounting and planning. Anna became the liaison. She ran around the city, collected orders, passed on messages. Her ability to disappear into the crowd and appear out of nowhere proved invaluable. Not theft, reconnaissance. Dan did what he knew how to do. He walked, he hauled, he tied things down, he loaded. Over the next 2 weeks, he made 4 trips. Thomas, Marin, Emily. 3 farms to the west, 1 new farm to the south. The system's volume exceeded 60 cubic meters, 21 anchor points. Total cargo volume was approaching 10 tons. The network was growing. Yorick baked bread. Morgan handed out salt and butter. Widow Kane cooked a stew from fresh vegetables, and people lined up all the way to the next block. Bertrand treated patients. The boy with the burn was on the mend. Emily's ointment was working. Dan passed Bertrand a note from Emily with instructions for use. Bertrand read it and said that this country herbalist knew pharmacology better than the city doctors. Dan shrugged. He said she just liked things to be in their proper place. Rumors spread. Slowly, like oil on water. In the slums, people whispered that a man had appeared somewhere who brought food and medicine. Not a merchant, not a benefactor, just someone. No one knew who. No one knew how. But Yorick's bread never ran out, and Bertrand's ointment never ran out, and Widow Kane's stew became thick and tasty. People came. They ate. They paid what they could. Sometimes they didn't pay. Yorick didn't push them. Dan said not to push them. Whoever couldn't pay today would pay when they could, and if they couldn't, then they didn't have to. At the warehouse in Seattle, the write-off rate was 2%. Here, Dan set it at 10. Because here, a write-off meant someone's life. One evening, Sarah was poring over the spreadsheets when she suddenly stopped. She looked up. She looked at Dan. She said the numbers didn't add up. Dan walked over. She showed him. Over the past 2 weeks, 4 tons of goods had passed through their network. At the house's prices, that would have been worth about $8,000. They sold it for $3,000. The difference is $5,000. Those $5,000 are the money the houses didn't get. Over 2 weeks. If you extrapolate that to a month, that's $10,000. For 6 months, $60,000. Dan understood where she was going with this. Sarah said that for the House of Valmont, 10,000 copper coins was the cost of a single caravan. Small change. They hadn't noticed yet. But at 60,000, they would notice. At 100,000, they'd sound the alarm. At 200,000, they'd send in mercenaries. Dan sat down. He looked at the numbers. Sarah was right. Every sack of flour he carried past the houses was a slap in the face. A small one, inconspicuous, but slaps add up. And sooner or later, someone will turn around. He asked how much time they had. Sarah calculated. At the current rate, 3 to 4 months before the leak becomes noticeable in the house's quarterly reports. Maybe 5, if they're lucky. Dan nodded. 5 months. To become big enough that they couldn't just crush him, or invisible enough that they wouldn't find him. Sarah said invisibility was better. Dan agreed. It would get big later. Right now, it needed to be small. Small and fast. Like a mouse in a warehouse, eating just a crumb at a time. But every day. Sarah restructured the network's operations, dividing it into procurement, storage, and distribution. She introduced a subscription payment model and a double-entry accounting system. The network grew to 21 locations and 10 tons of total cargo turnover. Sarah calculated that in 3 to 5 months, the revenue leak would attract the attention of the trading houses. A month had passed. The first real month since Dan woke up on the dirt floor. He counted. 31 days, 18 trips, 140 tons of cargo turnover. The system's volume had grown to 120 cubic meters, 34 anchor points. Of those, 20 in Halden and 14 beyond its borders. Flour, salt, vegetables, medicine, oil, honey, coal, leather, wool, thread. The product range expanded every week. Sarah kept track of everything on 3 boards. Anna ran around town like a shuttle. Yorick baked bread and smiled at customers. Morgan distributed goods and grumbled that things had been better organized in his day. Widow Kane cooked soup for the whole neighborhood. Bertrand treated the sick. The system worked. Not perfectly, with glitches, with mistakes, but it worked. Dan stood on the roof of an abandoned house by the southern wall. Point 6, his observation post. He looked out over the city and thought. Below, along the southern road, a caravan was passing. 20 wagons. The Valmont House seal on each one. Guards. 16 men. Spears, crossbows, light armor. The caravan was carrying fabrics from Eastern manufacturers. Sarah had found out from former acquaintances in the chancellery. Fabrics that cost as much as silver in the city. Dan wasn't envious. He didn't need their fabrics. He needed his own routes, his own suppliers, his own network. A parallel, invisible. One that doesn't compete with the houses directly, but simply exists alongside them. Like a second layer,
like an underground stream beneath the pavement. The house people walk on the pavement and don't know that water flows beneath them. He climbed down from the roof. He headed toward the warehouse. On the way, he noticed a tail. A man in gray, plain-looking, average height, average looks. He'd been following him from the market. Third turn, fourth, the same distance. Dan didn't speed up, didn't turn off. He walked toward the well in the artisan quarter. 0.5.
It's always crowded there.
He drew some water, stood there for a while. The man in gray stopped at a pot stand across the street. He pretended to be choosing. Dan slowly walked on. 3 blocks later, the tail was gone, or hid better. That evening, Dan told Sarah she wasn't surprised. She said she'd expected it sooner. Most likely it wasn't the house, but the city guard. One of the market overseers had noticed that faces in the slums looked too well fed. The guard reports to the house. The house sends its people. The usual chain of events. We need to change routes. Dan changed routes for 3 days. He no longer went directly from the warehouse to the recipients. He took detours. He used courtyards as shortcuts. Anna showed him 4 passages known only to the slum kids. Through the cobbler's basement, through a hole in the wall of an old laundry, across the roof and down the drain pipe, through a sewer tunnel that Dan would have preferred not to know about, but which worked flawlessly. At the same time, he decided it was time to venture beyond his immediate circle. Flour and vegetables are for survival. But the city doesn't live on survival alone. Blacksmith Graham needs ore. Seamstress Martha needs fabric. Carpenter Benedict needs nails. Each of them is a workshop that could be working, but isn't because the houses have cut off the raw materials. He needed to head north, to the mountain provinces, where they mine ore and smelt iron. He was already used to the 2-day journey south to Thomas, but north is 5 days. Over the pass, through the territory of the House of Belrosh. No roads, no shelter. No guarantee they'd let him back in. He told Sarah he was leaving for 10 days. She didn't try to talk him out of it. She said the network would hold up. Supplies would last 2 weeks. Anna would be the liaison. Morgan would handle distribution. Yorick would do the baking. Everything would work out. Dan had to go and do what only he could do. Set up new nodes. He left before dawn. The North Gate, the road to Bergstall. The road climbed. Forests, hills. By the end of the first day, he had passed a burned-out village, empty houses, charred beams, a burned-down barn. War. Westmark was at war with the mountain clans, and the border villages were caught in the crossfire. Dan marked a point by the burned-out well, point 35, just in case. Then he moved on. On the 3rd day, he came upon the mountain village of Steinhall. Small, stone houses, smoke from the chimneys, a smithy on the outskirts, the clang of a hammer. Dan followed the sound. The blacksmith was working alone. A broad-shouldered man in his 50s. He was striking the anvil evenly and rhythmically, making nails from old horseshoes. Like Graham in Halden, because there was no ore. Dan stopped at the entrance. The blacksmith looked at him. Dan asked where they bought ore. The blacksmith smirked. He said they didn't buy ore here. They mined it here. The mine was half a league up the slope. Only the mine was closed. The Belrosh Company had bought the concession 2 years ago. They'd posted guards. All the ore was being hauled off to the capital. The locals got nothing. The blacksmith pointed. Over there, beyond that ridge. Dan thanked him. He headed toward the mine. Not toward the main entrance. Along the path around it. He was looking for the waste dumps. There are spoil piles next to every mine. Rock that's been discarded. There's always ore left in it. Low-grade ore. The kind the big smelters won't take. But it's enough for a village blacksmith. At the warehouse in Seattle, Dan had seen rejected goods being returned.
Half of it could be sold at a discount, but it was easier to write it off. Same here. The ore lay in the dumps. Tons of ore. Nobody's. Written off. Like that flour in the basement on the first day. He found the dumps west of the mine. Unguarded. Why guard trash? Dan went down, started working. Rocks. Heavy. His hands were raw after 10 minutes, but he kept hauling, one chunk after another. He'd grab it, load it, grab it, load it. 3 hours. About a ton of rock. His hands were bloody. His back wouldn't straighten. The system's volume jumped. 150 cubic meters. The ore was heavy, and the workload was piling up fast. Dan sat on the pile and caught his breath. His hands were shaking. Every finger ached on its own. He thought that at least in Seattle he'd had gloves. Then he stood up. He walked down to the village. He went to the blacksmith. He said he had ore. The blacksmith looked at his hands. He looked at him. He asked where it was from. Dan said from the dumps. The blacksmith said the ore from the dumps was bad. Dan said that bad was better than nothing. The blacksmith was silent for a moment. Then he nodded. Dan unloaded the ore behind the smithy. He staked the claim right there. Claim 36. The blacksmith watched the growing pile of rocks that appeared out of nowhere. His expression didn't change. Mountain folk didn't ask unnecessary questions. Dan said he needed something in return. Not money. Nails, spikes, horseshoes, anything the blacksmith could make from this ore. He'd keep half for himself. Dan would take the other half and deliver it to a blacksmith in town who also had nothing to work with. The blacksmith said his name was Helm, that he was a fourth-generation blacksmith, that his father and grandfather had traded directly with Halden, without the houses, and that he agreed. Dan shook his hand. The handshake felt like a sledgehammer blow. He headed back. 5 days on the road. 5 days during which his network was left without a single supplier. But Sarah had calculated their supplies. 2 weeks. They had time. And when he returned, he would have ore for Graham, nails for Benedict, and a new waypoint in the mountains that opened up the entire northern route. On the way back, he marked 3 more points. Every place to sleep, every rest stop by a stream, every fork in the road. The points cost nothing. They simply were. They waited. Someday, each of them would become a node in the network. Every stream is a water point. Every fork is a crossroads of routes. He thought like a logistics expert. For the first time in his life, he wasn't maintaining someone else's network. He was building his own. And it was the best feeling he had ever known. Dan discovered he was being followed by the city guard and changed his routes through Halden. He made a 10-day trip to the mountain village of Steinhall, where he found ore in the dumps of a closed mine and struck a deal with the blacksmith Helm to exchange the ore for finished goods. The system grew to 150 cubic meters and 39 points. He returned, and the city was different. Not on the outside. On the outside, everything was the same. Dirt, noise, gutters. But inside the slum district, something had shifted. Dan could feel it in his bones. People walked differently, faster, with straight backs. The woman by the well didn't flinch at him, but nodded. The man at the intersection was carrying a plank on his shoulder and whistling something. The children were playing. They weren't sitting there with empty eyes. They were playing. Dan reached the warehouse. Anna met him at the gate. She looked different too. Cleaner. Her hair was combed. She was wearing a new shirt, or rather not new, but clean and mended. She said that while he was gone, Sarah had organized a barter system. Martha, the seamstress, mended clothes in exchange for food. Benedict, the carpenter, repaired furniture in exchange for salt. The potter from the far end of the block made bowls in exchange for clay that Morgan got from somewhere. The neighborhood was coming to life.
Dan went inside. Sarah was sitting at the table. She had a table. A wooden one, a crooked one, but a table. Benedict had knocked it together from old planks. On the table lay 3 charcoal slabs and a scroll. A real scroll. Parchment. Sarah had found the old parchment at a junk dealer's in the market and now kept her ledger on it. She looked up. She looked at Dan. She said she had news, good and bad. Dan said, "Give me the bad news." Sarah said that yesterday, people from the house of Valmont had come to see Morgan. Not guards, people from the house, in fine cloaks, with signet rings.
They asked where the goods came from. Morgan said he'd bought them from a passing cart driver. They didn't believe him. They left but promised to return. That meant the houses had started searching, not haphazardly, targeted. Someone in their analytical department had noticed an anomaly, a drop in sales in the slum district of Halden. Small, but steady. Dan sat on a sack. 3 months. Sarah had said 3 to 5. A little over 1 had passed. Too soon. Sarah said she'd miscalculated. She hadn't accounted for the fact that the house monitors not only its own sales, but also the resellers. A reseller who usually buys 10 sacks of flour a week from the house suddenly buys 8, then 6, then 4. The house asks the reseller. The reseller says demand has dropped. The house checks. Demand hasn't dropped. People are eating just as much. So someone else is supplying it. Simple arithmetic. Dan nodded. He would have figured it out the same way. At the warehouse in Seattle, discrepancies in the reports were found within a day. Here at the houses, it took a month and a half. Slower, but they found it. He asked what the good news was. Sarah smiled slightly. She said a woman had come to see her. From the upper city, not from the slums. Decent. A silversmith's wife. She asked if she could buy salt at a normal price, not the price at the house's shops, a normal one. Sarah asked how she knew. The woman said her cook buys bread from Yorick. The cook told her friend. The friend told her mistress. The mistress came. Dan understood what that meant. The network had spread beyond the slums. The upper city is the middle class, artisans, small merchants, bureaucrats, people who also suffer from the house's prices, only in silence, because they have something to lose. But if someone offers an alternative, they'll come, quietly, through the cooks and their friends, through whispers at the market. Sarah said it was both an opportunity and a threat. An opportunity because the upper city meant money. A threat because the upper city meant information. Every new client was a potential source of a leak. One conversation over lunch with an official, and the house would know everything. Dan thought. He needed a way to grow without drawing attention, to look small while remaining big, like a mouse in a warehouse. He remembered how there had been a mouse problem at his warehouse in Seattle. The battle against them lasted 3 years. Because the mice didn't build one big nest that could be found and destroyed, they built hundreds of small ones, in every crack, behind every wall, under every pallet. Kill 10, and 90 remain. That's what he needed. Not a single network with a single hub. Hundreds of small nodes, each independent, each knowing only its supplier and its recipient. No one sees the whole picture, except him. He explained it to Sarah. She listened. Then she said it was a cellular structure. Her father had used a similar scheme when he traded with smugglers, not out of choice. The Valmont house had cut off his legal routes, and he'd been forced to. Dan began restructuring the network the next day. Yorick no longer received flour from Dan. He got his supply from Morgan. Morgan got his from a nameless corner in an alley where Dan unloaded at night. Bertrand got his drugs not from Dan, but from the widow Kane, who picked them up from that same Morgan. 3 links in the chain. Each knew only the link next to them. If Dom took Yorick, he would lead to Morgan. If he took Morgan, he would lead to an empty alley. And the alley was just a wall and stones. Dan changed the unloading spot every 3 days. A new corner, a new courtyard, a new roof. Anna knew them all. Only Anna. She was the only link that couldn't be replaced. Dan understood that, and it bothered him. A 17-year-old girl as the sole point of failure for the entire system. He told her that, straight up. She needed to know. Anna listened intently. Then she said that if she got caught, she wouldn't say a word. Dan said that wasn't the point. The point was that if anything happened to her, the system would grind to a halt. He needed a backup. Someone who knows what she knows. Anna thought about it. She said she knew a boy, Patrick, 14 years old, from the slums too. Fast, too. Doesn't steal. He's too cowardly to steal. But he runs faster than she does and knows every alley in the city. Dan told her to bring him tomorrow. At the same time, he kept making his runs every 3 days, south and back. To Thomas for flour, to Marin for salt, to Emily for medicine, to the farmers for vegetables. Each trip was faster than the last. His body was getting stronger. His legs were getting used to it. He covered in a day a distance that a month ago had taken a day and a half. On one of the trips, he stopped by Emily's. She met him on the porch. In her hands was a small clay jug. Hot. Tea. Herbal. Made from her own herbs. Dan took the jug. He took a sip. The taste was strange and pleasant. Something floral, something bitter, something warm. Emily said it was her own blend. Mint, St. John's wort, rosehip, honey. It helps with fatigue. Dan stood on her porch with the teapot in his hands and felt the fatigue truly receding. Not from the tea, from the fact that someone had thought to brew him some tea. He thanked her, took the teapot, headed back. Halfway there, he stopped. He turned around. He went back to Emily. She was surprised. He said he'd forgotten to ask. In the neighboring village, the one where a child had died of fever. People there were still sick. Emily nodded. She said they were sick. Winter fever. 4 adults, 2 children. She was preparing medicine but had no one to take it to. It was a half-day's walk to the village. She couldn't leave her garden and cellar for half a day. Dan said she didn't need to go. She should just prepare it. He would deliver it. Emily looked at him. Then she went silently into the house. An hour later, she came out with a bag. 6 doses of the decoction, each one labeled, the patient's name, dosage, instructions for use. Dan took the bag. Asked what the village was called. Emily said, Westlake, straight along the shore to the north. Dan set off. Half a day. He found the village. Small. 8 houses. He found the patients. He gave them the medicine. To each one, personally. Into their hands. With instructions from Emily. He marked the spot. Spot 42. He returned to Emily before dark. He told her he delivered it. 6 hours. Not 2 days. 6 hours. Emily was standing on the porch. Her eyes were shining. She didn't say anything, just nodded, and went to make tea. The Valmont house began a targeted search for the source of contraband shipments through middlemen. Dan restructured the network into a mesh structure where each link knows only its neighbor. The network extended beyond the slums into the upper city. Dan delivered the medicine to Emily in the village of Westlake in 6 hours instead of 2 days, and saved 6 patients. The 3rd month. Dan stopped counting the days. He counted the runs. 38 runs a month. Sarah counted the tons. 220 tons of total cargo volume. The system's volume was 260 cubic meters, 50 anchor points. Halden, 12 farms, 3 mills, villages along the Cross River, the mountain settlement of Steinhall, 4 villages to the west, Westlake, and 6 more points along the roads, backups, just in case. The network was working, quietly, smoothly, like a well-oiled conveyor belt. In the morning, Dan loaded. In the afternoon, Morgan distributed. In the evening, Anna compiled reports. At night, Sarah crunched the numbers. 4 people, 4 links, and 1 system that tied it all together. Dan slept 4 hours, sometimes 3. His body held up, young, resilient, but he could feel the fatigue building up. Not physical, something else. The fatigue of responsibility. Every sack of flour he failed to deliver meant someone's day of hunger. Every jug of medicine he failed to deliver meant someone's sleepless night at the bedside of a sick child. He couldn't stop, couldn't slow down, because every day of delay meant real people, with names, with faces, people he knew. One morning, Sarah looked at him and said he looked like a corpse. Dan said he'd already died once and looked worse. Sarah didn't smile. She said he needed to sleep. A whole day. No flights, no accounting, no bags. Dan said he couldn't. Tomorrow he had to pick up the medicine from Emily. The day after tomorrow, the flour from Thomas. In 3 days, the ore from Helm. If he missed a day, everything would fall apart, the whole schedule. Sarah said that if he collapsed from exhaustion, everything would stop, not for a day, but forever. He was the only one who loaded the data. If he were gone, the system would die. Everything they'd built over 3 months would die with him. Dan fell silent. She was right. He was the system's single point of failure. Irony. He'd built a network without a single point of failure, yet he himself was its most vulnerable part. He lay down and slept for 16 hours. When he woke up, it was night. Anna was sleeping in her corner. Sarah was sitting at the table, writing by candlelight. He asked what she was writing. She said she was drawing up a plan for the next 3 months. Network expansion, new routes, new recipients, new goods. Dan sat down next to her. He looked at the parchment. Sarah was drawing a map. Not a geographical one, a logistical one. Nodes, connections, flows. In the center was a circle with the letter D, Dan. Lines radiated out from it to all the nodes. Every line ran through it. Every single one, without exception. Sarah pointed. This is what needs to change. He can't be the sole supply channel. He needs intermediate warehouses, points where the goods sit and wait, so he can load a 2-week supply in a single trip and not have to make runs every 3 days. Dan nodded. The system's capacity allowed for it. 260 cubic meters is roughly 20 standard containers. He could store tons of it. The problem wasn't storage, it was loading. He had to physically touch every bag, every jug, every piece of ore. Thousands of touches per trip. Hours of work. His hands couldn't keep up. He thought. At the warehouse in Seattle, they used pallets. 30 boxes on a single pallet. 1 lift with the forklift. 1 move. 30 units. He needed pallets. Here they were called something else, but the idea was the same. Tie 10 sacks into 1 bundle. Tie them with rope. Place them on a board. Touch the board. Load everything together as a single unit. He tried it that morning. He tied 5 bags of flour with rope, placed them on a board, put his hand on the board. The system recognized it all as a single object. 5 bags, 1 touch. Dan sat on the floor of Thomas's mill and smiled. Thomas asked what he was so happy about. Dan said he had invented the pallet. Thomas didn't understand.
It didn't matter. He could now load 3 times as much in a single trip. Because instead of 100 touches, he only needed 30. His hands got less tired. Time was saved. Cargo turnover jumped. Volume shot up. 280, 300, 320 cubic meters. He returned to Halden with a month's supply of flour in a single trip. When Morgan saw the volume of the shipment, he sat down on a barrel and was silent for a long time. Then he said that he'd been trading coal for 20 years and had never seen a single person bring in that much at once. Dan said it was optimization. Morgan said it was sorcery. Dan didn't argue. That same evening, Anna came running with news. People from the House of Valmont had arrested a middleman at the market, the one who used to buy flour from the house but was now buying less. They were questioning him at the guardhouse. They asked him who he was getting it from. The middleman knew nothing. He really was buying less because his customers were buying bread from Yorick instead of him. He didn't know where Yorick got his flour. But Dom didn't believe him. Dan listened and did the math in his head. The middleman's arrest was an escalation. The house had moved from surveillance to action. The next step would be searches, then interrogations, then Yorick, then Morgan, then him. He needed to speed things up, not in supplies, in distribution. The more people he fed, the harder it would be for the domes to find the source. One bakery with cheap bread is an anomaly. 10 bakeries with cheap bread is a trend. 100 shops with normal prices is a new reality. One that can't be fought with arrests, because you can't arrest reality. He stood up. He told Sarah he was leaving tomorrow. She asked, where? He said west, to the coast. Fish, salt, seafood. A new route, new suppliers, new locations. Sarah nodded. Then she said quietly that he didn't have to do this alone. Dan looked at her. She looked back. For the first time in 3 months, there was neither distrust nor calculation. Worry. For him. Dan looked away. He said he knew. But he was still the only one who could load the cargo. It was his job, his shift, his warehouse. Sarah said that warehouses had days off. Dan said not his warehouse. And he walked out. The western route was different, wider, busier. Wagons were going both ways, merchants, pilgrims, soldiers. Dan walked along the shoulder and counted. Every wagon bore the Valmont House seal. Every other one. Every third one. The western road belonged entirely to the Valmonts. The outpost stood halfway between here and Halden, more imposing than the southern one. A stone booth, 4 guards, a barrier made of oak logs. Dan walked past. A vagabond with a stick. No one looked his way. By evening on the second day, he saw the sea. Gray, cold, endless. He stood on the cliff and watched. In Seattle, he lived an hour's drive from Puget Sound, but had never gone there. No time, always no time. And here he stood on the edge of a foreign continent, looking at a foreign sea, feeling the wind on his face, and thinking how beautiful it was. Then he went down to the shore, the fishing village of Salt Haven. 20 houses, boats on the sand, nets on stakes. The smell of fish was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Dan walked to the pier. The fishermen were mending their nets. They looked at him without interest. He asked who bought the fish. An old man with a weather-beaten face grinned. He said that carters used to come. Not anymore. The Valmont House had set a quota. A fisherman could only sell his catch through an approved buyer. The buyer paid 3 pennies per basket. In Halden, the same basket cost 30. A 10-fold markup. Fish that wasn't sold by the end of the day went bad. Half the catch was thrown away. Dan looked toward the shore. 3 boats had returned with the morning catch. Baskets of fish lay on the sand, fresh, silvery. In a day, it would rot, unless it ended up in a cold storage unit. Dan asked how many baskets a day. The old man said 20, maybe 30. It depends on the season. Dan said he'd buy 10 every day, 5 dimes a basket. The old man looked at him like he was crazy. 5 dimes, almost twice what the buyer pays. He asked how he'd get it out. Dan said he'd get them out. The old man asked through whose checkpoint. Dan said not through a checkpoint. The old man was silent. Then he called over 2 other fishermen. They spoke among themselves quietly, quickly, in a local dialect that Dan could barely make out. Then the old man turned and said his name was Edwin, that he'd been fishing in Salthaven for 40 years, that his sons fished, that his grandchildren were starving because the fish was rotting on the shore, while in town they asked for silver for it. That if this skinny guy with a stick could get the fish into town past the Valmonts, then Edwin would sell him everything he caught. Dan shook his hand. Tied up at the dock, spot 51. He started loading. The baskets were heavy, wet. The fish slipped through his fingers. Dan hauled them and thought that the fish at his warehouse in Seattle had been transported in refrigerated trucks at -18 degrees. And here the fish went into a cold cabinet where time had stopped. Better than any refrigerated truck. 10 baskets, about 200 kilograms. The fish inside the system had frozen solid, fresh, as if just out of the water. He could store it for a week, a month, a year. It wouldn't spoil, but there was no point in keeping it. In Halden, people ate meat once a week, if they were lucky. Fish was protein, cheap, affordable, if he could set up a supply. He spent the night on the shore. In the morning, he loaded up 10 more baskets, and then some. The fishermen watched. They said nothing. The baskets disappeared. Dan paid. 5 copper coins apiece. On the 3rd day, he went further along the coast. 2 hours later, he found a second village, Bryn Mawr, also a fishing village, also stifled by quotas. He marked the spot, bought fish. Onward. A 3rd village, a 4th. By the end of the week, he had 6 waypoints along the coast and enough fish to last a month. The system's volume had exceeded 400 cubic meters. On the way back, he marked waypoints every few hours, a fork in the road, a bridge, a stream, an abandoned barn. Every point is a future node. Every node is an opportunity. He thought on the go. Fish is good, but fish is a perishable commodity. In the ordinary world, not in his system. But people on the outside don't know that. If he starts selling fresh fish in Halden every day, it will raise questions. Fresh sea fish in a city 2 days' journey from the sea. Every day. Without fail. That's impossible without a caravan of refrigerated wagons, which no one has. People back home would notice instantly. He needed a different approach. Not fresh fish. Salted. Dried. Smoked. A product that could come from anywhere and be stored for weeks. No one would ask where the salted fish came from. It could have come from any caravan. He needed a smoker, or a salter. Someone who could turn a fresh catch into a product that wouldn't arouse suspicion. He returned to Halden. He told Sarah. She thought for 10 minutes. Then she said she knew someone. The widow of a fisherman on the canal. She used to smoke fish for her husband. Her husband drowned 2 years ago. The smokehouse stands closed, but the ovens are intact. Dan went to see the widow that same day. A small woman with dark circles under her eyes and the smell of smoke in her hair. She listened in silence. Then she opened the smokehouse. She showed him the ovens, 4 of them, brick, in good condition. Dan marked the spot. He unloaded the fish, fresh, glistening, as if it had come out of the sea an hour ago. The widow looked at the fish, then at Dan, then back at the fish. She said she hadn't seen fish this fresh since she lived on the coast 10 years ago. She asked how. Dan said he'd delivered it quickly. She didn't ask any further. 3 days later, smoked fish appeared at the market in the slum district. Cheap. 4 pennies apiece instead of 12 in the shops back home. The line stretched until evening. Dan watched from the roof. Anna sat nearby. She dangled her feet in the air and ate smoked mackerel. She said it was the best fish she'd ever eaten in her life. Dan asked if she'd ever eaten fish before. Anna thought for a moment. She said once. She'd stolen it from a counter, raw. Tasted awful. Dan looked down at the city below and thought, 60 reference points, 400 cubic meters, flour, salt, vegetables, medicine, ore, fish, 6 product categories, 12 suppliers, 8 recipients in the city, 1 smokehouse, 1 loader. 2 months before the Dom find him. Maybe 3, if he's lucky. He needed more locations, more routes, more people he feeds. Because every person he feeds is a voice that will say no when the house comes to take him away. Dan made it to the coast and set up fish deliveries from 6 fishing villages. He solved the problem of disguising perishable goods through the smokehouse of a fisherman's widow in Halden. The network grew to 60 distribution points and 400 cubic meters. Cheap smoked fish appeared on the market. In the 4th month, Dan heard his nickname for the first time. The Quiet Merchant. That's what a cart driver on the southern road called him. Dan was walking back from Thomas's place and stopped at a roadside well to draw water. The cart driver was watering his horse. They struck up a conversation. The cart driver said something strange was going on in Halden. Prices were creeping down. Not everything, but bread, salt, fish, medicine. People back home are going crazy. They're looking for someone. They call him the Silent Merchant. They say he works alone, no caravan, no warehouses, no people. He appears and disappears. Goods materialize out of thin air. Dan listened and drank water. His face was calm. Inside, a chill. They're looking for him. Actively. By name. Even if it's just a nickname. The cart driver said that, personally, he respects this silent merchant, whoever he may be. Because his mother-in-law in Halden is eating her fill for the first time in a year. Dan finished his water, said goodbye, moved on. He thought. A nickname is a bad thing. A nickname means people are talking about him. Talking means they're looking for him. Looking means they'll find him. It's only a matter of time. He picked up the pace. Over the next 3 weeks, he made 12 trips. The coast, farms, mountains, mills, villages. Every trip was loaded to capacity. The pallets were working. Bundles of 10 to 15 bags. One touch. Cargo turnover jumped to a total of 500 tons. The system's volume was 550 cubic meters, 80 anchor points. And then, what he had been waiting for and fearing happened. The 6th month. Early morning. Dan was returning from a night run. He was approaching Halden from the south, and he saw smoke. Not smoke from a stove. Black, thick, coming from the slum district. He ran, through the south gate, through the market, through the alleys. Anna met him on the run. Her face was pale, her eyes wild. She said people had come during the night. 10 men, in masks. They set fire to the fishmonger's widow's smokehouse. They set fire to Morgan's shop. They beat up the porter who worked for Bertrand. They left a note. On the wall of Yorick's bakery, in charcoal, one word. Enough. Dan stood in the middle of the alley and watched the smoke. The smokehouse was burning. Morgan stood by his shed with a battered face and looked at the charred crates. The fisherman's widow sat on the ground, rocking back and forth. Her ovens, the 4 brick ovens she'd tended for 2 years, smashed. Dan walked over to Morgan, asked if he was hurt. Morgan spat out blood, said he was alive, that he'd seen their faces, that they were people from the House of Valmont, not guards, mercenaries, the kind who do the dirty work. Dan went to Yorick. The old man stood by his oven, kneading dough, calmly, just like every morning. On the wall behind him, a word loomed in black. Enough. Yorick looked at Dan, said he wouldn't stop, that he'd baked bread through 3 changes of government, through 2 fires, through the plague, and he'd keep baking as long as his hands held out. Dan nodded, said there'd be flour, always. He went to the storeroom. Sarah was waiting. She was composed, her face stony, just like on the first day. She laid out her notes on the table, said this was the beginning. The Valmont house has shifted from searching to applying pressure. For now, they're squeezing the periphery. Morgana, the smokehouse, the small fry. The next step will be harsher, and the next, until they find the center. Dan asked what to do. Sarah said they had 2 options. The first was to shut down the network, go underground, wait it out. The second was to expand so quickly that it would become impossible to crack down on them. Because you can't burn down 100 smokehouses. You can't beat up 200 shopkeepers. You can't intimidate the whole city. Dan was silent. He thought. The first option meant that people would go hungry again, that Yorick would close his bakery, that the boy with the burn wouldn't get his ointment, that the fish would rot on the shore, that everything would go back to the way it was. He chose the second. That same day, he headed north, not toward Steinhall, further, toward where the war was raging, toward where entire provinces were starving, toward where the word bread sounded like a prayer. He needed Minsho Khan. He didn't know it yet, but the world was already leading him to her. The journey north took 4 days, over the pass, through burned-out villages, past the Belle Roche House checkpoints, which no longer checked vagrants because there were simply too many of them. Refugees were heading south, by the dozens, by the hundreds. Women with children, old men with bundles, deserting soldiers with empty eyes. The war had cut off 3 provinces from supplies. The house didn't help. Why should it? Famine drives up prices. Prices drive up profits. Everything according to plan. Dan was going against the flow, north, to the place everyone was fleeing from. He marked points as he went, every fork in the road, every bridge, every ruin, point by point. 85, 90, 95. On the 5th day, he reached the town of Trevelyan, or rather, what was left of it. The walls still stood, but the gates were boarded up from the inside. Smoke from burning fires hung over the town. Not a fire, heating. They were burning everything that would burn. Furniture, doors, fences, because there was no firewood. Dan walked around the wall, found a breach, climbed in. Inside, it was worse than he'd imagined. The streets were empty. The houses were boarded up. People sat by the fires and didn't move. Thin, gray. He'd seen faces like that in photographs in history textbooks. Hunger. Real hunger. Not the Haldoan kind of hunger where bread is expensive, the kind where there is no bread. None at all. He walked down Trevelyan's main street and counted. People. The living. How much food was needed, how much medicine, how many blankets, how much firewood. The professional calculator in his head clicked like a machine. 2,000 people, roughly. Half a kilo of food per person per day is a ton a day. 7 tons for a week's supply. He had about 4 tons of various items in his system. Flour, fish, vegetables. Enough for 4 days. Not a week. 4 days. but 4 days is 4 days of life. He stepped out onto the central square. He stood still. He marked a point. Point 100, a round number. And he began unloading, silently. No speeches, no explanations. A sack of flour, another one. A basket of fish, smoked. A sack of salt. Jars of ointment from Emily. Bundles of dried berries for scurvy. Blankets he'd bought from a weaver in the village a week ago and stored in the system. Firewood. He'd thought to stock up on firewood. 3 trips back, he'd loaded cut logs from the sawmill past Steinhall, just in case. The case had come. People were approaching, slowly, like shadows. An old woman in rags, a man on a crutch, a woman with a child who wasn't crying. Children who don't cry from hunger are the scariest thing Dan has ever seen in this world. They looked at the food, at the bread, at the fish, and didn't believe it. The old woman came closer. She touched the sack of flour, real, warm. She looked at Dan. She whispered, asking who he was. Dan wiped his face with his sleeve, a dirty streak on his cheek. He said he was a delivery man, that he'd brought them dinner. Then he sat down on the step and watched as the people ate. Silently, greedily, carefully, as if they were afraid the food would disappear. He sat there and thought he could have been faster. If he hadn't gotten lost on the way, if he'd known the way, if he'd left a day earlier, he could have been faster. It's always possible to go faster. At night, a woman approached him, tall, with a scar across her eyebrow, in torn chainmail. 2 short swords on her back. She moved like a fighter, even tired, even wounded, even hungry. She moved in such a way that Dan instinctively took a step back. She said she'd seen him unloading, that she'd seen the sacks appear out of thin air, that she didn't care how, that she needed food for the 12 people she'd led out of the besieged fort 3 days ago. Dan asked who she was. She said Min-Soo Han, former captain of the caravan guard, now a nobody. Dan retrieved bread from the system, fish, water. He handed it to her. She took it, didn't say thank you, left. She returned an hour later, alone. She said the people had eaten, that 2 were wounded. They needed ointment. Dan took out Emily's ointment. Min-Soo took it. She was silent. Then she said she would guard him. Dan said he hadn't asked for it. Min-Soo said he hadn't asked. She'd decided on her own. Because a man who walks into a besieged city and feeds strangers out of thin air is either a saint or an idiot. In either case, he needs protection. Dan didn't argue. The Valmont house began exerting force. They burned down the smokehouse and beat up Morgan. Dan chose expansion over retreat and headed north into the war zone. He reached the besieged Trevelyan and fed 2,000 starving people. He met Min-Soo Khan, who became his bodyguard. Min-Soo changed everything. Not like Sarah. Sarah changed his mindset. Min-Soo changed the pace. With her by his side, Dan could travel at night, through the forest, through clan territory, past checkpoints that used to take him half a day to bypass. Min-Soo knew the roads, the trails, passes. She had led caravans for 10 years and remembered every rock from the coast to the mountains. The first week after Trevelyan, they headed east. Dan marked waypoints. Min-Soo covered his back, silently, without a word. She ate for 3 and spoke for half. When Dan asked why she'd decided to stay, she said she'd spent her whole life other people's gold, and now she guards other people's bread. It's better. On the 10th day, they returned to Halden. 112 waypoints. The system's volume was 700 cubic meters. Dan walked through the slum district and saw the changes. The fishmonger's widow's smokehouse had been restored. Not by her.
The neighbors got together and rebuilt it in 3 days. New ovens. Better than the old ones. Benedict the carpenter did it for free. Morgan worked with his head bandaged and grumbling as usual. Yorick was baking. The word on the wall had been painted over. Dan went into the warehouse. Sarah, Anna, they were waiting. Sarah showed him the 2-week report. Turnover through the network had grown by 40%. Not because Dan had brought in more, because people had started trading with each other. Blacksmith Graham made nails from Helma ore and sold them to Carpenter Benedict. Benedict built shelves for Bertrand. Bertrand treated the children of seamstress Martha. Martha sewed aprons for the widow Kane. A circle, closed, self-sustaining. Dan was just the spark. The network burned on its own. Sarah said this was what her father had dreamed of. An economy that works not because someone forces it, but because it's in people's best interest to help one another. Dan sat down and exhaled. For the first time in 6 months, he felt he could breathe. But it was too early to breathe out. Anna brought news. Bad news. Lady Corvina Valmont had arrived in Halden, in person, the head of the house. 51 years old, 30 years in power, a woman who decided the fate of provinces over breakfast. She had brought with her 20 mercenaries and 2 mage trackers. Mage trackers. Dan tensed. Sarah explained. Trackers search for magical traces. Any magic leaves a mark. Teleportation especially so. Dan recalled the description of his system. Teleportation leaves no magical trace. Invisible. Silent. He relaxed, a little. But Corvin wasn't here for the magic. She was here for the people. People can be bought, intimidated, broken. The next few days were tense. Corvina's people walked through the slums. They talked. They asked questions. They offered money for information. Who supplied cheap bread? Who sold fish? Where the medicine came from? No one spoke up. Not a single person from the slum district said a word. Dan found out about this from Anna. She ran around the district like a shuttle, gathering information, passing on warnings. Dan sat in the warehouse and thought about how these people were protecting him. Not because he ordered them to, not because he pays them, because he feeds them. And they remember that. Corvina wasn't used to silence. She was used to money opening any mouth. But in the slums of Halden, money meant less than bread. And Dan provided the bread. 3 weeks after Corvina's arrival, what Dan feared most happened. They took Yorick. They didn't arrest him, formally. They invited him for a chat at the Valmont House mansion. 2 men in fine cloaks approached in the morning and politely asked him to come with them. Yorick went, because refusal would mean a search of the bakery, confiscation of the flour, shutdown. He went to protect the bakery. Anna ran over 10 minutes later. She was out of breath. Dan listened. His face was calm. Inside, everything tightened. Min-Su stood up. She put her hands on her swords. Dan said no, not by force. They won't do anything to him, not yet. They want information. Yorick knows nothing. He only knows Morgan. Morgan only knows the back alley where the goods appear. The alley is empty. The chain breaks. Sarah said this is temporary protection. Sooner or later they'll track Anna, or Patrick, or one of the recipients, and they'll find the warehouse. Dan stood up. He said it was time to move. The warehouse had been his home for 4 months. The first place in this world. The place where he woke up, where he found the system, where he taught Anna to count, where Sarah drew her first chart. He packed everything up in an hour. There wasn't much to pack. Charcoal boards, Sarah's scroll, Anna's mattress, blankets, food. Everything went into the system. The warehouse was left empty, just like on the first day, only without the flower by the wall. They moved into the basement of an abandoned house by the south wall, Point 6, a former observation post, cramped, damp, but inconspicuous. Yorick was released after 6 hours. He returned silent, angry. He sat by the stove, said that Lady Corvina had spoken with him personally for an hour, over tea, politely, as if with an equal. She asked about the silent merchant. Yorick said he didn't know any silent merchant, that he buys flour from the carters. Corvina smiled. She said she understood, that she held no grudge, that she simply wanted to know. Then she said that if the silent merchant didn't come forward himself, in a month there would be a famine in the slums, a real one, because House Valmont would cut off all supplies to Halden. Everything, down to the last sack. The whole city would starve until one man stepped forward and gave his name. Yorick repeated this in an even voice, without emotion. Then he fell silent. Dan stood and listened. Corvina wasn't threatening him. She was threatening the city. The whole city. 100,000 people, for the sake of one. He looked at Sarah, at Minz, at Anna, at Yorick. Sarah said quietly that it was chess. Corvina was sacrificing pawns to save the king, a classic gambit. Dan said he wasn't the king. Sarah said that to Corvina, he was the king, because without him, the network would die. Dan was silent. Then he said the network wouldn't die, because in a month, he'd have enough supplies to feed all of Halden. All of it. Without the houses, without caravans, without outside shipments. Just from his system. Sarah looked at him. She asked how much was needed. Dan calculated in his head. 100,000 people. Half a kilo of food a day. 50 tons a day. 1,500 tons a month. He had 400 tons in his system. He needed another 1,100 for a month. He looked at his hands. Someone else's hands with someone else's calluses. 1,000 tons, personally, to touch every sack with his own hands. He stood up. He said he was leaving tomorrow. Minsu stood up too. He said no. She needed to stay, to guard Sarah, Anna, Yorick. Minsu said it was an order. Dan said it was a request. Minsu was silent. Then she sat down. Dan left before dawn. Minsu Han became Dan's combat partner, and together they expanded the network to 112 locations. Lady Corvina Valmont personally arrived in Halden with mercenaries and mages. No one from the slum district betrayed Dan. Corvina threatened a complete blockade of the city, and Dan decided to stockpile 1,500 tons of supplies in a month. That month was the longest of his life. In both lives. He didn't sleep. Almost. 2 hours a day, sometimes 3. His body was kept going by sheer willpower and Emily's tea, which she brewed every time he showed up. The route was as follows. Dawn, south, Thomas's Mill, loading, farms, 3, 4, 5 farms a day, loading, west, the coast, fish, 10 baskets, 20, 30, loading, north, mountains, ore, firewood, wool, loading, back, night, unloading in Halden, 3 hours of sleep, dawn again, south again. He crisscrossed the continent like a pendulum, south, west, north, south, west, north. Every day, new tons into the system. The volume grew so fast that Dan stopped counting. 1,000 cubic meters, 1,500, 2. The system expanded from the cargo turnover, and the cargo turnover was monstrous. Hundreds of tons a week. Dan carried bags until his arms could no longer bend.
Then he sat for 10 minutes. Then he hauled them again. Pallets helped, but even with pallets, 1,000 tons is 1,000 touches, thousands of lifts, thousands of steps. In the second week, he fell. He just fell. On the road between Cross Lake and Halden, his legs gave out and he lay on the shoulder staring at the sky. A foreign sky, foreign clouds, a foreign world he hadn't asked to enter. He lay there for 5 minutes, got up, kept going. Emily was the first to notice. When he came for his medicine, she looked at him and said he was going to die. Not by the sword, not by the houses. From exhaustion. Dan said he wouldn't die. She said he would die if he didn't eat and sleep. She grabbed his arm and sat him down on a bench by the porch. She brought food, vegetable soup, bread, honey, tea. Dan ate, slowly. His hands were shaking so much that he spilled soup on his knees. Emily watched. Her eyes were red. She said he was doing too much. Dan said he was doing exactly as much as was needed. She said no one had asked him to feed the whole town. Dan said no one had asked him either. He'd decided on his own. Because if not him, then who? Emily sat down beside him. She was silent. Then she rested her head on his shoulder, quietly, without a word. Dan froze. He wasn't used to being touched, not in this life nor in the last. He sat motionless, feeling the warmth of a stranger's head on his shoulder, and thought that this was probably the strangest moment of his career as a logistics specialist. Then he stood up. He gathered the goods. He moved on. By the end of the third week, he had 1,200 tons. 300 remained. Corvina was keeping her promise. Shipments to Halden had stopped. Everything. Caravans turned back at the gates. Ships didn't enter the port. The market emptied day by day. Prices skyrocketed. Bread for 20 copper coins, salt for 50. Meat had vanished. Fish had vanished. The city was starting to panic. Dan didn't intervene. Not yet. Sarah was running the network. Small shipments, only for her own people. Only for those who were in the system. The slum district was eating. The rest of the city was starving. It was unfair. Dan knew it. But if he started feeding everyone now, the supplies would run out before he could stockpile enough. He had to wait. Count. Be patient. At the end of the fourth week, Una found him, or rather, she found Sarah. A note delivered via the cook, via the laundress, via a young messenger boy, found its way to Anna. Anna brought it to Sarah. Sarah read it and turned pale. Una Cha, the hostage princess from the island kingdom, a captive of the Valmont mansion. She wrote that Corvina was preparing a final strike. In a week. Not a blockade. Worse, she was gathering people from the villages. The very villages Dan had been helping, gathering them as hostages, under the pretext of a census. To Halden. To the square. 1,000 people. And she'll announce that she'll execute one a day until the silent merchant surrenders. Attached to the note was a floor plan of the Valmont mansion. Every floor, every corridor, every guard post. Una had drawn it from memory. 5 years in a golden cage. She knew every stone. Dan read the note, read it again, sat down on the basement floor, closed his eyes. 1,000 hostages, from his villages, people he knew by name. Farmers from whom he bought carrots, fishermen he paid 5 copper coins to, Marin the widow, Thomas the miller, maybe Emily. He opened his eyes, looked at Sarah, at Minsu, at Anna. Sarah said it was a trap. Dan said he knew. Minsu said she would go with him. Dan said he knew. Anna said she'd give him her last copper coin for luck.
Dan took the coin, put it in his pocket, stood up, looked at the interface. 1,460 tons. Not 1,500, but close. Enough. He turned to Sarah, said that if he didn't come back, the network had to keep going. Supplies would last a month. In a month, she would find new suppliers. She would establish regular routes without his system. Longer, more expensive, but possible. Her father could have done it, and so could she. Sarah looked at him. Then she said he would return. Dan didn't answer, because he wasn't sure. The morning was gray, low clouds, a wind from the east. Dan walked through the city toward the main square. Minsu walked 2 steps behind him. Her swords were on her back. Her face was calm, as always. Halden Square was large, stone pavement, City Hall on one side, the Valmont House on the other. Between them was an open space where the market usually stood. There was no market now. There were people. 1,000 people, from the villages, from the farms, from the fishing villages. Dan saw familiar faces. Thomas, the miller, stood in the front row. Next to him, the widow Marin. Edwin, the fisherman from Salthaven. Helm, the blacksmith from Steinhall. Dozens, hundreds, people he knew by name, whom he had shaken hands with, whom he had fed. They stood silently, under guard. 40 mercenaries in chainmail along the perimeter. On the town hall balcony stood Corvina Valmont, gray-haired, upright, in a dark dress. Standing next to her were representatives of 4 more trading houses, Crashford, Bellaroche, 2 others Dan didn't know. 5 out of 7 houses. They had come to watch. Dan stepped out onto the square, alone. Minso stayed at the edge. He hadn't asked her to. She'd decided on her own, covering his retreat. Dan walked across the square, scanning the faces. Thomas saw him. The miller's eyes widened. He recognized him. The skinny guy who came for flour, who paid 4 copper coins a sack, who always came back. Thomas opened his mouth. Dan shook his head almost imperceptibly. Don't. Be quiet. He reached the center of the square, stopped, looked up, at the balcony. Corvina was looking down. Their eyes met. Dan saw before him a woman who had controlled the fates of thousands of people for 30 years, who made decisions about famine without hesitation, who believed that the world rested on her house and that without it, everything would collapse. He didn't see a villain before him. He saw a manager, a top-level one, the kind who look at spreadsheets and don't see the people behind the numbers. He knew people like that. At the warehouse in Seattle, his regional director was like that. A good man, a loving father, who signed orders to cut 50 jobs without batting an eye because the quarterly report demanded optimization. Dan took a breath. His voice was soft, but the square was quiet and everyone heard him. He said his name was Dan. Just Dan. That he was the one they called the silent merchant. That he wasn't a merchant, not a magician, not an agent of the Eastern Emperor, not a prophet, not a god. He was a stevedore. Corvina listened. Her face was impassive. Dan said he hadn't come to surrender. He had come to show them something. He raised his hands, and sacks began to appear above the square. Dan unloaded them. Everything. 1,460 tons. Everything he had gathered over the past 6 months. Everything he'd carried on his back. Every sack of flour, every basket of fish, every jar of ointment, every bundle of herbs, every blanket, every log. The sacks fell onto the pavement like snow. Quietly, thickly, endlessly. The square filled up. Mountains of flour, mountains of fish, smoked, fresh. So fresh, it was as if it had come from the sea an hour ago, because for it, an hour was all it took. Time didn't pass inside. Salt,
vegetables, honey, ore, nails, cloth, wool, firewood, medicine, tools. Everything the people from 200 villages had given him over the past 6 months. Everything he had carried on his back through forests and mountain passes. The square was drowning in goods. Literally, the pavement vanished beneath the sacks. The mercenaries were retreating. They had nowhere to set foot. The guards of House Valmont stood and watched. Because among those guards were sons from the villages, from those very villages. And they recognized the sacks. They recognized the flour. They recognized the bread. It was Yorick's bread. It was Emily's ointment. It was the widow Marin's salt. It was Edwin's fish. Every sack had a story. Every sack had been grown by someone, ground by someone, packed by someone, and handed personally to Dan by someone. Dan was done. He stood in the middle of the square, knee-deep in sacks. His hands were hanging down. His face was gray with exhaustion. He looked up at Corvin. He said quietly, "You took 1,000 hostages. I brought gifts for 200,000 people. See who has more friends." The square was silent. Then a woman stepped out of the crowd of hostages. That very old woman from Trevelyan. The one who had asked who he was. She stepped out and stood beside him. Then Thomas the miller stepped out. Then Edwin the fisherman. Then Marin the widow. Then Helm the blacksmith. One by one, 10, 20, 50, 100. They stepped out of the crowd of hostages and stood beside the skinny young man knee-deep in sacks of flour. The guards of House Valmont stood around the perimeter, halberds raised. But their hands did not move, because the sergeant of the guard recognized his mother in the crowd, whom he had not seen in 2 years, who was alive because 6 months ago a thin stranger had brought her a sack of grain and a jar of ointment for arthritis. The sergeant dropped his halberd. Behind him, a second, a third, a 10th. Corvina stood on the balcony and watched. Her face remained unchanged, but her hands on the railing turned white. She saw her guards lower their weapons. She saw her mercenaries retreat. How 1,000 hostages turned into 1,000 witnesses, and how one man stood in the middle of a mountain of sacks of flour and didn't draw his weapon. Because his weapon was the flour, and the fish, and the medicine, and the nails, and the blankets, and the 1,000 people who knew him by name. She turned to the representatives of the other houses. Crashford stared at the floor. Belrosh looked away. The other two were already leaving. Corvina remained alone on the balcony. She looked down at Dan for a long time. Then she turned and went back into the building. The square exhaled as one. 1,000 breaths at once, and the movement began. People grabbed the sacks. They weren't stealing, they were sorting. Everyone knew which one was theirs. Thomas found his flour, Edwin his fish, Marin her salt. As if Dan had signed each sack. He had signed them. In the system, in his head. Each sack to each person. Dan stood and watched. Then his knees buckled and he sat down, right on the pavement, among the sacks. Minsu came over, sat down next to him. Sarah emerged from the crowd, pale, with wet eyes. She sat down next to him. Then Anna. Then Emily came out from behind the town hall. She had come. She had left her cellar and her garden beds and walked for 2 days because Anna had sent her a note. She sat down next to them, silently. Leah was the last to arrive. A quiet woman in faded blue clothes, a priestess of water. Dan didn't know when she had appeared in his life, somewhere between the 100th and the 120th point, somewhere on the road. She had come to him on her own. She asked him to carry the stones of her ruined altar to a new spring. He moved them. He didn't understand what had happened. She understood. To her, he was the one who carried the sacred alongside the ordinary, without distinguishing between them. She sat down next to him. 6 people on the pavement, among sacks of flour. And Anna placed a loaf on his lap. Warm, fresh, from Yorick's morning bake. The last loaf from the last sack of flour from the last delivery. She didn't steal it, not this time. She bought it, with her last coin. That very one. The one she'd given away for good luck and which Dan had returned to her because she needed the coin more. And she bought a loaf with it. For him. Dan took the loaf, took a bite. The bread was warm, delicious. The very bread that started it all, 6 months ago, when the old man with a gray beard broke off a piece and held it out to the vagrant. He chewed and looked up at the sky. A foreign sky, foreign clouds. His world, his city, his people. Then he said quietly, in English, so no one would understand, "Okay, now you can sleep." Minsu heard him. She didn't understand the words, but she understood the tone. She said it was too early to sleep, that she still needed to distribute the flour and feed the city and fix the smokehouse and send the medicine to Trevelyan. Dan closed his eyes. He said, after sleep. Everything after sleep. He fell asleep right on the pavement, among the sacks, among the people, amid his network, which no longer fit into any interface, which was alive, which was breathing. 200 villages, thousands of people, flour and fish and medicine and nails and blankets and salt and honey and firewood.
And one porter who lay on the stones and slept more soundly than he had in both his lifetimes. And 6 women and 1 girl sat nearby and didn't move. And Halden Square was alive all around them. Noisy, well-fed, alive. And no one left. Because this wasn't the end. It was the beginning. The beginning of a world where trade isn't the power of a handful of families, but the living fabric between ordinary people. Dan didn't know this. He was asleep. But the system knew. Somewhere deep inside his warehouse, a message flashed. Operator 8, status active. Service life, 6 months, 14 days. A record. All 7 before him had died within the first year. Dan survived. Not because he was stronger, not because he was smarter, but because he was a loader who didn't build an empire, but simply delivered to people what they needed. 1 sack at a time. 1 name at a time. 1 handshake at a time. And it turned out that this was stronger than any empire. Dan slept. And 200 villages slept peacefully. For the first time in a long time.